Boy, great.
All right, we'll go ahead and we're ready to go.
Okay. So moving right along in the regulations, we're on 46108, IRB functions and operations, and we did A. That's one of the more complicated sections of the regulations and more subtle. And what I want to do is move to 46108B, which is on page 10. Except when an expedited review procedure is used, review proposed research at convened meetings at which a majority of members of the IRB are present, including at least one member whose primary concerns are in non-scientific areas. In order for research to be approved, it shall receive the approval of a majority of those members present. So the main thing is, in order to have a convened IRB meeting, under the regulations, you need two things. You need to have a majority of members, which means greater than half, and thank you. And you need to have a non-scientific member present, and that's really it. That's all you need. Theoretically, you could have an IRB with 5 people. 3 people could show up, one scientist and one non-scientist, and they would be able to review research. And in fact, if 2 of them voted for the research, it would approve the protocol. And I think the people who wrote the regulations are well aware of that. And it's one of the reasons why I recommend really having smaller IRBs, because I think there's no I'm not sure you get a lot of value over having a ton of people in a room. Or when I was in management school, they taught me that if you want to have a functional meeting that is supposed to get work done, you either have 5 people or 7 people present. You got to have an odd number so that you break ties. But when you get fewer than 5, there's like not enough people there. And when you get more than 7, there's too many people there. And my rule generally is that whenever I watch IRB meetings that have more than 7 people, there usually is at most 5 people participating anyway. So I usually say just invite them to the meeting and let everybody else stay at home. So the issue here is quorum. Or in terms of what do you need in order to have a meeting. And this is hopefully going to bring us to a worksheet. This is worksheet 305, which is evaluation of quorum and expertise. And the first 2 items on there, greater than half of the IRB members are present. At least one member whose primary concern is in scientific areas is present. And that's really the regulatory requirements there to have a convened meeting. This, by the way, is a worksheet that somebody at the meeting will just have available. And the idea is that you're just, as people come and leave, you're just checking this and making sure that the meeting is appropriately convened. It does not, this is not, worksheets, by the way, are things that don't need to be filled out. It's just for reference to make sure that's the case. There are a couple things also. At least one member's primary concerns are in non-scientific areas. Actually, the first and third items are regulatory. The other items are really more requirements for accreditation and more good practice, which are really that you have a scientific member, you have an unaffiliated member, and a person who represents the general perspective of subjects. The other thing is this alternate issue, and that is that if you have 2 people who are both alternates for each other, they could both attend the meeting, but you need to make sure that they don't both vote at the same time if they're supposed to be alternates for each other. In addition, this is the part we talked about consultation, that there's really checking for expertise requirements, and this is usually done in advance of the meeting just to make sure that you have, if the research involves needs particular expertise, you have somebody with that. You have somebody with knowledge of the local context, somebody who knows about prisoners. If the research involves a drug or device, FDA says that an IRB member who's a licensed physician has to be present, so that's in there. If there's populations that are vulnerable to coercion or undue influence, there's somebody with knowledgeable about them. If any other specific expertise, there's a consultant with that expertise. And then there's a VA requirement with that if the research is Veterans Administration research, you have to have an IRB member who is a Veterans Administration representative present. And then if for some reason you do Department of Justice research that is funded by the National Institute on Disability and Rehabilitation Research, and the research includes children with disabilities or individuals with mental disabilities as research subjects, a person who is primarily concerned with the welfare of these subjects is present. And that is, that's a Department of Justice requirement. So, and in general, I can tell you know, I think an important thing to understand is all these worksheets and checklists are based upon the amalgamation of multiple requirements. If we only had one set of regulations to follow, we wouldn't have these, I can tell you. But the fact that there's so many different things, you can't just look at this regulation and say, everything I need to do is right here. So it's just a thing to keep in mind. The other thing is, okay, so for the research to be approved, it has to have approval of majority present at the meeting. One of the things, I'm sorry I have to emphasize, I just want to emphasize that majority means more than half. There are many people who think the majority means half plus one. It does not, it means just more than half. So if you have 9 people in a group, a majority is more than half, more than 4.5, which is 5. And if you have 8 people in a group, then the majority is more than half, which is 4, which is 5. So it's just remember that, more than half. And then that's sort of the easy way to remember that. Next thing is IRB review of research, which is that the IRB shall review and have the authority to approve, require modifications and to secure approval, or disapprove all research activities covered by this policy. I wanted to get. So I think that first of all, the term approve is pretty clear to people what it means. You can go ahead with the research, or you can change it, or continue with the research. There's the require modifications to secure approval is not well defined, and people use it differently. And the way it is defined in the SOPs is that when you say require modifications to secure approval, that means that the investigator has to make modifications that if they make those modifications to the protocol will be approvable. And that the person who reviews that has to make no judgments in terms of the regulatory criteria for approval. So this is really saying, we approve this provided you have the DSMB meet every 6 months. So anybody here could look at the protocol and say, it says the DSMB will meet every 6 months. We're done. But if it says something like, we approve this provided you tell us more information about the members of the DSMB and their qualifications to actually do this review. Now you're asking for information that when you look at, the question is, what is acceptable? What meets the criteria for approval? And now you have to make criteria for approval determinations in addition to that. So the main issue, although people talk about minor modifications, what I really like to point out is modifications that in the end do not require the person deciding whether the modifications were made to have to invoke the regulatory criteria to decide whether they're met or not. Yes?
I have a question going back to quorum. IRB has set a quorum in order to deliberate and vote.
Yes.
What about during providing a summary of the study? And let's say quorum is 5. One member walks out to go to the bathroom.
Right.
Should the discussion stop at that juncture?
Yeah. I mean, I would say, strictly speaking, under the regulations, you could argue that you need, you just need a quorum to take action. So you could have one person in the meeting talking to themselves and 5 people walk in and you could take a vote. I wouldn't recommend doing that. And I actually think the bigger issue with the quorum is really not to be in that circumstance. to have your IRB structured with alternates and flexibility in such a way that you're just never in that situation. You're not sort of on the edge of having quorum all the time. So if you have 16 people on your IRB and in general your meetings have 9 people there, have meetings with 9 people and get the 9 people who are going to be there and have that meeting, as opposed to artificially raising the bar by having 16 people and always having 7 that don't show up. So that would be my advice. But you might be able to get away with it and argue with the ORHP. No, it's just about the vote. It's about taking action. But there's sort of the spirit of the rule that's maybe missing.
I'm just thinking of sometimes we have IRB meetings where quorum is tight.
Yeah.
And we have 8 members. Let's say we need 8 members to have quorum.
Yeah.
And we may have a heavy agenda, and we're discussing a study, and let's say the primary reviewer is presenting a summary for the entire IRB.
Right.
And someone has to go to the bathroom. I'm just wondering if since there's no deliberation or vote, could they conceivably, as per the regulations, leave, come back, go to instead of telling them, no, you can't go to the bathroom, no one can leave the room at all. Or
just have stop discussion until they get back. Yeah. I won't say it's wrong. I wouldn't recommend it as a practice. And again, I think the more underlying issue is to set up the structure so you're not in that situation, that you're just not struggling with quorum all the time.
Let me just interject here. Cynthia and I were having a discussion with MJ last week. We were reviewing the minutes from Panel 6, and most of you have not been involved with Panel 6. That's a very small panel. And what's our quorum requirement? 5. What was recorded in the minutes? 4. I didn't write those. So the actual 4 would make quorum. I mean, I think there are 7 people. 7 members of that panel, so 4 is quorum. And this has nothing to do with Jeff and his toolkit. This is me and the institutional policy. There's no reason in the world we should ever have a meeting, or we would need to have a meeting with less than 5 people here. I mean, in terms of, we have 130 IRB members. We have alternates for every member who's on the panel. I mean, there's members and alternates again. And the frequency with which we meet, the flexibility, I would never want us to say, oh yes, we reviewed this very complicated facial transplant study and we had 4 people in the room doing it. Not when we have the expertise that we have and the experience that we have in our members. I just don't see that there would ever be an occasion that we shouldn't try to have, our quorum go above and beyond the 4 that, panel 6, our specialty panel has. I mean, to have 5 members there, properly constituted, and to have them for each committee, to have the majority, not down to the wire all the time. When we got down to the wire with 4, I said, why 4 and not 5? I mean, there's just it's not anything in the it completely meets the regulatory requirement for meeting quorum. It just doesn't make good sense in my book here at our institution when we have over 100 members of the IRB and we have 6 different panels of the IRB and we have 6 chairs that we couldn't scrape up another person or 2 and have more than 4 people sitting around the table. So that's just an editorial comment.
So we run require modifications to secure approval. And what's the issue there? And so you could probably imagine, if you will, let's say that you had investigators give you consent documents on Word format, and the IRB sat around at the meeting and they did everything they wanted. They did track changes, and they changed the document to what they want, and they handed it back to the investigator and said, this is what we're approving. Take it or leave it. There's actually, commercial IRBs actually do that. So that's sort of the ideal of modifications required to secure approval. This is what we want, take it or leave it. Similarly, if you can imagine if the IRB wants changes in the protocol, and they had a Word document of the protocol, they could make changes to the protocol, it used to be a floppy disk. Now it's a USB drive. Back to the investigator or email it to them and say, this is the protocol we approved, take it or leave it. And in a sense, what modifications required to secure approval conceptually should be that, except that you probably can't do the redlining of the consent document and the protocol, but it's basically saying, do this change, this change, this change, this change, this change, and that's the protocol we're approving. And that's actually how the IRB should be thinking. They should say, if you take this protocol and you make these changes, that is the protocol we will approve, no questions. So that's the second one. Now I can tell you that I've seen OHRP is a little loose in this, and sometimes they say requiring modifications to a secure approval are those things that have to go back to the convened IRB, but it's just defined in the SOPs. That's the way you define it, and just recognize that. And the other one is disapprove all research activities. Now, what's interesting is you guys do deferral, right? Okay. What's interesting is what is the IRB's authority to do a deferral? Not there. Okay. So in a sense, in a sense, the IRB doesn't really have authority to do deferral. You can still do deferrals, but I'll explain what we're going to do. And that is really, if it's not an approval, or if it's not, make these changes and that's what we're approving, the modifications required to secure approval, then it's got to be treated like a disapproval. It doesn't really matter what you call it. So if you defer, that's fine, but you have to think of it from a regulatory point of view that it's a disapproval. What does that mean? That means, as we get on, you have to tell the investigator the reasons for the deferral and give them an opportunity to respond. That's really what it means. If you want, you can get rid of the term. And I know people don't like doing this, but I can tell you that investigators get over it after about 6 weeks when they realize that everybody gets disapprovals now and then. It's like getting a paper rejected. You just revise it and you send it back, and that's that. So we actually, in my IRB, we actually at some point said we're just going to call them disapprovals, and a couple of people complained, and then after a while everybody just said, what the heck. But a lot of people don't like doing that, so I think you have a deferral category. And there's some really subtle difference between deferral and disapproval. I think deferral means that we'll give you some ideas about how to make the protocol better, and disapproval is we're at a loss to tell you how to make the protocol better. But in a sense, if you disapprove a protocol and somebody resubmits, you got to look at it. You might look at it and say, hey, it's okay. Functionally, it's not really any different than a disapproval, except under your SOPs, which is we have some suggestions versus we don't. The IRB shall require that information given to subjects as part of informed consent is in accordance with 116. And the IRB may require information in addition to that to be given with subjects when in the IRB's judgment the information would meaningfully add to additional protection of subjects. One of the things that you want to make sure is that in this is that the review of the consent and the consent process and the consent document is a function of the IRB. I have no problem with staff looking at things and saying, I think this is missing, I think that is missing, but it is inappropriate for the IRB to say it's not our responsibility to check, for example, consent documents for the required elements of consent. That's really the IRB's ultimate responsibility, so they need to do that. The IRB shall require documentation of informed consent or may waive documentation in accordance with 46117. Pretty straightforward. An IRB shall notify investigators and institution in writing of its decision to approve or disapprove the proposed research activity or modifications required to secure approval of a research activity. So in the template letters, we don't need to get into that right now, but in the template letters, there are letters for approval, for modifications required to secure approval, for deferral and disapproval. And basically, it's just notify the investigator in writing of the decision. They'll be put into CLIC, into Cicero. If the IRB decides to disapprove a research activity, it shall include in its written notifications a statement of the reasons for its decision and give the investigator an opportunity to respond in person or in writing. Both the deferral letter and disapproval letter have that. They look identical, except that one has suggestions for improvement and one just says this. One says this is what's wrong and here's the suggestions, and the other one says this is what's wrong. The disapproval just doesn't give suggestions. But otherwise they're pretty interchangeable. An IRB shall, it is, I think one of the things that's important here, I think we were talking about this morning about one of the things I think you should be careful with, the IRB should be careful with, is really situations where the IRB wants to say, we're always going to, you're banned from being an investigator for the next 5 years. And I think under the regs, it's hard to make a justification for making a requirement that has to go to the IRB. The IRB's got to look at it and say, well, that's right, we banned you for 5 years, we're disapproving the research. And the reasons are because of that mistake you made 5 years ago or 3 years ago. So I think it's one of the things I'm big on is that the IRB's got the disapproval authority. Now, the institutional official can say, you're not submitting things to the IRB, it's an institutional issue. But I think as far as the IRB goes, the IRB's got to be careful not, sort of exerting the authority that it can decide whether investigators conduct research as opposed to deciding whether individual research projects can be conducted. But they can certainly review it and quickly disapprove it and say, because we don't believe you can do research, and just leave it at that. And again, with the deferral, you have to give the statement of reasons. An IRB shall conduct continuing review of research covered by this policy at intervals appropriate to the degree of risk, but not less than once per year, and shall have and period. And I think we went over the procedures, how that is implemented. And shall have the authority to observe or have a third party observe the consent process and the research. And that basically is an authority. There happens to be an SOP for how to do that, but it's not usually, it happens uncommonly. Yes?
I had a question about something that was in the reading about continuing review
Yes.
and the OHRP guidance.
Yes.
I just wanted to clarify because I'm not sure that
Okay.
I'm understanding. When continuing review occurs annually and the IRB performs continuing review within 30 days before the IRB approval date expires, the IRB may retain the anniversary date as the date by which the continuing review must occur.
Correct.
So an example of that would be, let's say that approval expires August 25th,
Right.
2010.
Right.
And the IRB performed the review on August 14th, 2010.
Okay, what was the first date again?
August 25th, today's
25th.
date.
Okay.
Mhm. And then the IRB met on, let's say, August 14th. The anniversary date can still remain as August 25th
Correct.
of 2011.
Correct.
Okay.
According
guys
to
don't follow.
regulations, but not here.
Okay.
I mean, we're set up so that it's automatically done,
Mhm.
so there's no point in changing, there's no point in making it till the end of the month.
Right.
Well, I won't say that. We're keeping it as is.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to, I know that it's OHRP guidance, but I wasn't sure that I was understanding it correctly. So just
No,
wanted to
you're right.
clarify.
You're
Okay.
absolutely right. You're absolutely right. But if you reviewed it today and then you reviewed it, comes July 23rd
Mhm.
of 2011, then it would have to be, then the renewal period would have to be based on July 23rd.
Mhm.
So that's OHRP basically saying 1 year is 365 days, except only for the first time, and the second time it's 12 months. So anyways. But no, if I had my druthers, I would basically have something like whatever month we approve it in, it expires at the end of the month a year later. And I think that would be fully in line with the intent of the regulations. So did I ever say, like, when you guys elect me king, I'll like
Yes.
Okay.
But here, I'm the queen, so.
I said the queen, right, that's right. That's right.
We're not gonna reprogram the computer. We're
Right,
gonna report
right.
it manually.
We used to have the princess of process and the Raja of regulation, so we need to pick those up too. The regent of regulation. Let's see, we talked about expedited review before. I think the one thing I want to just go over expedited review is some process issues. and that is under expedited review procedure, the review may be carried out by the IRB chairperson or one or more experienced reviewers designated by the chairperson from among the members of the IRB. So some key points here is that in order to do expedited review, you have to be an IRB member. You can be an alternate IRB member, but you got to be an IRB member. You have to be an experienced IRB member, and you have to be designated by the chair to conduct that review. Experienced is something that is not defined in the regulations, but I think is defined in the SOPs as that the chair decides that you have experience. Experience means that you know how to be an IRB member, which is different than expertise. Expertise means you understand some scientific discipline. This is not about expertise. This is about experience being an IRB member. And then the other issue is that the chair has to make the designation. The way that's implemented here is that in the SOPs is that the chair basically sends a communication and says the following people can be I designate the following people as reviewers who can use the experienced reviewers who can use the expedited procedure. And that becomes a designation, and then staff get to pick which expedited reviewer that they want to use. So when you guys are expedited reviewers, there'll be some designation for you. There'll be an alternate IRB member. There'll be some designation that you're experienced staff based on your training, and that the chair designates you as being able to do expedited review. And then the decision, then that gives you sort of a pool of expedited reviewers, and the decision about who actually reviews is based upon your decision and judgment of taking from that pool. There's a couple other ways of doing this, but you will find people around the country where the IRB manager says, when I run out of expedited reviewers, I pick somebody and they do it. And there's no involvement of the chair, and that is contrary to the regulations. In reviewing research, the reviewers may exercise all of the authorities of the IRB except that the reviewers may not disapprove the research. So here's another one where you have the deferral statement. And it wouldn't make sense if it said you can defer the research, but you can't disapprove it. So really, if you're doing review by the expedited procedure, you can either say this is good, or if you make these changes, I'll approve it. There's certainly no problem getting into a dialogue with somebody, but I think an important issue when you're doing expedited review is that if you and the investigator are having a conversation and you're not coming to agreement, it's time to go to the convened IRB. That's it. Because otherwise you're sort of doing a de facto disapproval by sort of holding things up. The other thing which I like to also avoid is having staff in this situation and saying the IRB will not accept your research. Or you have to fill out this form or the IRB is not going to accept the research. And so part of the procedures are what you can say to investigators, if you don't fill out that form, I don't think the IRB is going to approve this. That's fine. Would you like to fill out the form? And when they say no, you put it on the convened IRB meeting. I don't care whether it's exempt or expedited or whatever. You put it on the convened IRB meeting with a note saying, investigator asked to fill out form, refused to fill out form, and the IRB can disapprove it. And they don't have to spend a lot of time on it. But really, that would be the formal process to sort of say, it's not you, you're not disapproving. The chair's not disapproving. Susan's not disapproving. It's the convened IRB. It's a strong message to say. And after a while, people learn that when you guys recommend something, then it's good to listen. When E.F. Hutton talks, it's that old.
Does everybody's got that? That eliminates administrative modifications. There will be no more administrative modifications back and forth and up and down and all around. It's either they'll do it correctly, it'll get processed, or if they don't want to, they refuse, whatever, it'll go to the IRB, it'll get disapproved.
Yeah, and there's no problem, depending on what your internal processes are, there's no problem with saying, this is the kind of thing that you should change. Although typically generally I want staff to be making decisions in these sorts of issues. I want staff to be making decisions that are pretty black and white. In other words, you're supposed to fill out this form, you didn't fill out this form. You left this section blank, you didn't do it. When it comes to issues where that doesn't look like a very good data safety monitoring plan, that I think would be better leading to the IRB to decide, and not doing that. What some institutions do is they set up a separate track where an investigator can work with an IRB analyst who will sort of act like a mock reviewer and go back and forth and help them out write a protocol. But that's at the option of the investigator if you wanted to do something like that. But I think it's important that the judgment calls get done by the IRB, and you can basically say, look, you're using a drug and you didn't fill out the drug appendix. And they can say, I don't have to fill it. I got one guy, so I don't want to fill out the device appendix. And I go, okay. So actually, that was my conversation just now. I said, well, send it to the IRB and let the IRB disapprove. It was actually probably an exempt study, so. But and just say, look, if they don't want to comply with the rules, just send it to the IRB and let them do it. Yes. Oh, yes.
Susan, is that a new? I was not here last week, so is that a new plan process
Yes.
then? So if then they say I will fill out the form, do you give them a time limit, and then they can go ahead and be okay, it's fine without going to like a reviewer or.
So I believe we say 30, they have 30 days. I think that's what it says in here.
Yeah,
If they say, yes, I want to provide the additional information, I think we give, is it 2 weeks or is it 2 weeks?
There's a couple different issues here. One is the way the SOPs are written, I don't know how Cicero works, and we have to play with it. But the way that Cicero works is if you talk to an investigator and you say, look, you didn't submit the investigator brochure, you didn't submit this, do you want to withdraw it and submit it again, or do you want to? And the way my business flows work is it gets a status of withdrawn. The investigator can always change withdrawn to submitted by submitting new information, but it can be withdrawn forever. I mean, once it's withdrawn, it's just off the table. It's not an active protocol. The difference is that if the IRB says at a meeting or under expedited review says make these changes, and we will approve the protocol, then there's a deadline to that.
How it'll work is they'll submit it. Karen will look at it and say, you're missing the consent document. Do you want to include a consent document? And it's an honest error or whatever. She'll return to the PI, and it'll, with a note that, contacted PI, error, did not attach consent document, will attach. Then they get, I think we put in here, I don't know if it's 2 weeks or within 30 days to send it back.
Okay.
And that's we'll use the admin mods function for that, but that's it.
It's in there for modifications required to secure approval. I didn't think it was in there for that. Let me ask you this question, just functional.
Mm-hmm.
Can an investigator go and start filling out the application
Mm-hmm.
and sort of leave it there and come back 6 weeks later and fill out the application?
It's the state.
And
it's
what's
called draft.
Okay, so my recommendation would be is that if they say, look, I'll get you that investigator brochure, it's draft. If you can do that, if it's just it's stamped, okay.
No.
So you can't do
talk
that. So
about-
that's the way it is.
We'll talk about the details.
But in essentially, it's just it's like they haven't really submitted it yet.
But will we still be using the administrative modification function one time to send them all of our contingencies, initially upon initial review? But you're saying not the back and forth.
Yeah, you're not going to be doing, and even the administrative review like you've been doing, it's not going to be the same type of review that you've been doing.
Okay.
And we're going to go over that more and, be more education and training for you guys more specifically about the review process. Okay. But it's not going to be the same where you've gone through every aspect and you provide them detailed information.
Mm-hmm.
And for those, Anita, you weren't, for those, just to, so everybody's on the same page, because when you're out there talking with investigators, especially the cancer center, that's one of the biggest complaints we have. And not to belabor this story, but we implemented this process 6 years ago to help prevent protocols from getting deferred and disapproved at the convened IRB meetings. So we wanted to help investigators get their information in, fill in all the blanks, provide adequate information for the IRB to review and be able to make a decision, have enough information. They loved it at first. It was called the Deferral Prevention Program. They loved it. We decreased our deferrals from like 6 a meeting down to maybe 1 a meeting. I think for, it was like 1 to 2 a month. That's what we had. So here we are 6 years later, and what's one of the biggest complaints that the research community has? Well, what's the analyst telling me what I should do with my study? Why is the analyst, an untrained person telling me how I should change my study or what I should have in my application? So I think the new process, and I think Jeff's toolkit, and I think this is perfect. That it's again putting the onus on the investigator, and you guys will work with them to make sure that everything is complete. But this is one if I had to bet on this research community, having been around with them for a couple of years now, I would bet that it's going to be a shock to their system, and then they're going to be complaining, why don't I get information? Why don't I get feedback from the analyst before my protocol goes and gets disapproved?
So you give them a choice. They can if they want.
Right.
It's up to them. But yeah, no, it's I hear this a lot. The exact same thing, exact same scenario. But and that one option, it's like the thing. Anybody who's got kids, that it's much. If your kid's acting up, the better thing than saying don't act up is to say, well, you can play this game or you can go outside and play. It's like you give them a choice, and suddenly it's like, so you have to use that same technique with your investigators and say, you can have it go directly to the IRB, or you can work with an analyst. It's up to you. It's whichever one you want. So let's see here. 46110C is the next thing. Each IRB which uses an expedited review procedure shall adopt a method for keeping all members advised of research protocols which have been approved under the procedure. And that mechanism, it's interesting. You just have to advise people. There's no need to take votes on what was expedited. There's no need to put it in the agenda. There's no need to put it in the minutes. And if you can, I'll tell you what I would do. If I had Cicero, is I would send a weekly email to IRB members saying these are the protocols that have been approved by the expedited procedure, and you would meet this, and you would save everybody a lot of work and paper and time and agenda and things like that. Or you could even have a web posting on Cicero of what was approved, and you could send IRB members like an email saying, click this link if you want to see what was approved last week under expedited review. So you have a lot of cool things you can do.
So if we were to configure Cicero, which is perfect, we have the capability of doing fairly easily, to send an automatic email notification to the IRB members when the approval button is hit for the expedited reviews, the exempt determinations, that would suffice.
That would suffice. I'd probably go nuts if I were an IRB member. Because it would, because you could get 20 of those a day. Right? Yeah. 50. Yeah. No, I wouldn't do that. I think I could tolerate the weekly or monthly digest, or the other would be if there's a way to.
They get the IRB meeting. If they get the list.
Yeah, I would, you could send them I'd just send them an email periodically and find out what people would do most, weekly or monthly, what they'd be most happy with, and then, or the other one is if there's some way to have a report. If you can have a web page that gives a report of everything approved in the last week, then you can just send them an email link and say, here's the protocols. Click here and you'll see the protocols, and then I want to click on it. That's like their problem.
It's actually currently in our meeting workspace, so every time we send out the agenda for any given meeting, all of those are there.
Yeah, it can be done the same way. I'm just trying to say that this is the way it's done. You're doing it that way because that's the way people do it when there were no computers and you had to do everything by paper. And it's just and now there's cool options that will be just as fine, will meet the regulations, and maybe even cut down on email traffic.
I just had a question about this, all members. So that would be all members of that particular panel, not all 135 members.
This is really written before anybody ever thought about the idea that an institution would have more than one IRB. And in general, I know certainly at AHARP we had this discussion. We said you only need to tell the people on the corresponding IRB, but it does get sort of, actually, I don't know what, in a way.
A panel of the IRB, which is a duly constituted,
so it's whoever's
IRB,
and then caseload.
This is why even with I'm looking for the computer to have the least restrictive, least intrusive kind of, send the web link. Here's the page. You want to look at it? That's fine. Don't want to look at it? That's fine. And everybody gets all the information that's there. But there's no. I mean, I know people who, whatever meeting's coming up that week, they get everything done that week. Other people somehow divide the expedited reviews by committee, even though, in a way, you can't really assign a committee to expedited review in most places. So you have a lot of flexibility. You can do about anything, as long as you pick some mechanism to let them know and follow it in your SOPs. Let's see. Let's go on to 46112, review by institution. Research covered by this policy that has been approved by the IRB may be subject to further review and approval by officials of the institution. However, these officials may not approve research if it has not been approved by the IRB. So pretty straightforward, and I think it is important to know institutional officials can. The cool thing is, now when the IRB terminates research, or they suspend research, or they disapprove research, they have to tell the investigator why and give them an opportunity to respond. When the institution suspends or terminates or disapproves research, they can do it for any reason they want. And as I used to tell the administrators, they don't even have to tell the investigator why they're doing it.
That's power.
That's power, right. So I remember having this conversation with the chief of nursing at my institution. It says, you approved that study and it's havoc in the operating room now. And he goes, well, tell them not to do it. No, but the IRB approved it. And I said, no, you can do it for any reason you want. Suspension or termination of IRB approval of research. The IRB shall have the authority to suspend or terminate approval of all research that is not being conducted in accordance with the IRB's requirements or that has been associated with unexpected serious harm to subjects. Any suspension or termination of approval, must have a typo, shall include a statement of the reasons for the IRB's action and shall be reported promptly to the investigator, appropriate institutional officials, and department or agency. So the only really new thing here is just like approvals, suspensions have to have a statement of the IRB's reasons. And there are template letters for telling people about suspensions or terminations that have a little blank in them and say, fill here the reasons why the IRB wants to disapprove the research. And the template minutes queries that also.
Can I ask a question
Yes.
on 112?
Yes.
The last sentence.
Mhm.
Says the official may not approve the research if it's not been approved by, and the word I'm asking is the word an IRB.
Correct.
Any IRB.
Yes.
So if the CALGB IRB approved a protocol, is that to say that the IO could approve that protocol for this institution without it going through our IRB? I'm not proposing to do
Right,
that,
right.
but that's what I just read.
If you go back to the assurance requirements, it would have to be an IRB listed on your FWA.
Oh, okay.
So you could put that on your FWA, and then you could
Oh, that's
go forward with that IRB. Giving you ideas. You're going to rely on other IRBs.
No. I just, you've told me to pay close attention to the word.
No, that's great. No, it's cool. It's
To the
cool.
wording.
It's great. It's excellent. The other thing is, this is like when you do, when you do really well and they invite you out to go look at somebody else's SOPs. It's just amazing the number of times I see people write down that the institution may not approve research that's been disapproved by the IRB. And I always remind them that's not what the regs say. Because it doesn't mean that, like, the IRB hasn't gotten around to disapproving it, so no, I can approve it. They can't approve anything that hasn't been approved by the IRB. 150. Let's see. Honesty of cooperative research, because that's really not really relevant here. 46115 IRB records. An institution, or where appropriate, an IRB shall prepare and maintain adequate documentation of IRB activities, including the following. And there's a list of things that the IRB has to have in its records. And they are copies of the protocol files is basically what one is. Minutes, records of continuing review activities, correspondence between the IRB and investigators, list of IRB members, your roster, written procedures for the IRB, and statements of significant new findings provided to subjects as required by above. In addition, it talks about in B, and I want to sort of skip to B initially. The records required by this policy shall be retained for at least 3 years. So there are several records required by the policy. One is the records that are listed here in 115A. But, what other records are there that are mentioned in the regulations? And one of them is consent documents. So one is I would include in this consent documents so that investigators have the requirement to keep consent documents for at least 3 years after completion of the research. And another one I want to point out is also a little bit subtle is if you have to move around to certain areas here. If you go to 116C, on page 14, it says an IRB may approve a consent procedure which does not include or which alters some or all of the elements of informed consent set forth above, or waive the requirement to obtain informed consent provided the IRB finds, and the key words, and documents that the following are true. So this means that IRB records, you have to document that, therefore it becomes a record required by the procedure or by the regulations. And this documentation needs to be maintained for the 3 years or longer. And if you look throughout the regs, there's a lot of times when it says find and documents that. Subpart B, Subpart C, Subpart D, waivers of documentation of consent, and planned emergency research. So all these things, these findings that need to be documented also become part of records. So that's where, in addition to, you have to look a little bit broader than the 4611A, 115A. And also, then let's just go forward. So it says all records required by this policy shall be retained for at least 3 years, and records relating to research which is conducted shall be retained for at least 3 years after completion of the research. This is another one where I want to just point out FDA regulations and a little bit of difference. If you go to 56115, on page 40 is 56115B. And this says the records required by this regulation shall be retained for at least 3 years after completion of the research. Whereas the HHS says the records required by this policy shall be retained for at least 3 years, and records relating to research which is conducted shall be retained for at least 3 years after completion of the research. So it's interesting. HHS sort of says you got to keep everything for 3 years, and if it's related to research, keep it for 3 years after completion of the research. Whereas FDA just says keep everything for 3 years after completion of the research. Were you going to say something? Oh, okay. So it's sort of an interesting difference. What does that mean? Well, since everything the IRB does is about research, I'll tell you how they interpret this. And I think what you can think of is that you can sort of split things into things that are very protocol specific and things that may relate to one or more protocols. And a protocol specific thing then would be A1, copies of all research proposals reviewed, scientific evaluations that accompany the protocols, approved sample consent documents, progress reports submitted by investigators, and reports of injuries. Reports of continuing review activities would also be protocol specific, and those two, that they would be mainly, in other words, that you're going to be related to one protocol, and some correspondence is going to be related to a protocol. So that information you can keep for 3 years after completion of the research, and then you can chuck it. Other things, though, there's minutes. You know, how do minutes relate to research? What if you have correspondence that's like, what day does the IRB meeting take place? Or your list of IRB members, your written procedures. Actually, I left that statement of new findings would be related to protocol. But you know, how do these things work? Both, from the HHS regulations to say these records need to be retained for 3 years. So you keep your minutes, you keep your rosters, you keep your procedures for 3 years. But it's not there in FDA. And after discussions with FDA and OHRP, they thankfully agreed on the same thing, but you won't like what they say. Basically what it is that when it comes down to minutes need to be retained for 3 years after the last completed research discussed in the minutes. Okay. Procedures need to be retained for 3 years until the last protocol reviewed under those procedures has been closed for 3 years, and so on. So just to make life simple, the SOPs say indefinitely. Just keep them forever. So essentially, you need to keep minutes really indefinitely. You need to keep unrelated correspondence that you can't relate it to a protocol indefinitely. You need to keep your IRB rosters indefinitely, and you need to keep previous versions of procedures indefinitely. So one of the things you want to make sure and set up is any old versions of procedures you need to keep, because if there's some study you have that's been active since 1990, and FDA and OHRP, and you approved it in January 1990, OHRP and FDA can say, we want to see the procedures that you used to approve that research in January 1990. And no, they don't want to see it. But they have the authority to do that. So that's just
Doesn't matter electronically versus paper?
No. What are you smiling at?
Well, because as you mentioned before, I don't know if it's
I just
like
figured this
20
out 5
years,
years
but
ago.
you and I go back a long
Right,
way,
I
and
know,
I was going to
yeah.
say this is in stark contrast to your former opinion.
Yeah, I know. That's because I gave a talk.
So
where
all the stuff I threw away, we shouldn't know.
Right. Just tell them you got bad advice.
Now, I have a serious question, though, about the electronic.
Yes.
It's not like keeping paper, but
Right.
certainly we have server space,
Yes.
and we have a lot of, there are, give me guidance on destroying electronic files.
Right. What you want to do is you want to have a policy for how you do it. You want to follow the policy systematically. So the worst thing an organization can do is say, we keep records for 3 years after completion of the research. But in practice, they keep it indefinitely until FDA walks in the door, in which case they go back and start destroying records. That is bad news. However, if you have a process that says each July we go through, we destroy all records that meet these criteria, and FDA walks in August, and you can say we did it this July, last July, and here's our procedure, and that's what we do, then you can do that, and it's not a problem. So if you want to do that, you need to have some sort of procedure for doing that. You need to take into account not only this law, you need to consider HIPAA if you keep HIPAA information associated with it. You may need to consider other state law about retention of records. You may need to consider University of Maryland policy about retention of records. But basically you can do that. But I would do something like, it's just like each January we're going to purge files, or each month or something. Have a process, identify all the files that can be erased and erase them. But you want to do it that way, in a very systematic and deliberate way, and following a policy. And making sure your legal counsel says that that's okay, or just buy a bigger hard drive. So, so those are the things there. The other one, then, I want to going into a little bit of detail on the records requirements. I want to point out approved sample consent documents. What that refers to in OHRP's interpretation is that generally when there is a NIH-sponsored multi-center trial, and you see this pretty much for every NCI-sponsored trial, there is a sample consent document that has been through some internal review. Almost all oncology studies have them, but I've seen where heart, lung, and blood studies and some other studies, AIDS studies, will also have their sample document. And OHRP has said that's what we want you to review. In addition, there's OHRP guidance that if you deviate from the risk or alternatives in a significant way, OHRP wants that written in the minutes as to why you did that. That was based on a case in Pittsburgh. Charlie McCarthy actually was head of OPRR at the time, and somebody, I forget what, it was some breast cancer study, and they basically took out important alternatives, they took out important risks, and so in a governmental fashion, they said, well, then you got to check this each time. So that was the basis of that. Let's see. The other one is minutes of IRB meetings, which shall be in sufficient detail to show attendance at the meetings, actions taken by the IRB, the votes on these actions, including number of members voting for, against, and abstaining, the basis for requiring changes in or disapproving research, and a written summary of the discussion of controverted issues in the resolution. So the first thing is that you want to have minutes that show sufficient detail in terms of attendance. The way that this is accomplished with the model SOPs is that at the beginning of the meeting, you record everybody who is present at the meeting. And then with each vote, you record who was not present for that vote, not physically present. They can be not physically present because they were just not in the meeting, or they could be not physically present because they were absent because of a conflicting interest. And you have to distinguish between those two. But that way you can go through it. The trick is, from FDA and OHRP's point of view, or an auditor looking at the records, they want to be able to say, at this meeting, who was present at the vote. It's not how they voted, although if it's a unanimous vote, that's obvious. But it's really saying that if you have 9 people on your IRB, 2 of which are non-scientists, and somewhere you say 2 people were out of the room and 7 people were voting, as far as OHRP was concerned, if you don't have it documented, it was the 2 non-scientists who left the room. So it's really knowing who was present for quorum determinations. Let's see. The actions taken by the IRB, it's important that if the IRB decides something, that it's clear in the minutes what that action is. That's usually straightforward. The vote on these actions, including the number of members voting for, against, and abstaining. So there should be a motion. You won't see this here, but I'll tell you all the things you'll see at other IRBs, I guess. So sometimes the IRBs record things as approve, disapprove, require modifications to secure approval, and those are like the votes, or abstain. And then I actually had somebody who did this, and then an FDA visited them, and it was something that they voted to disapprove. Or the motion was to disapprove the research, and then all the IRB members voted to approve. And the FDA guy went nuts, and he said, "You approved the research," and said, "No, we didn't. We disapproved the research," and they were just going back and forth. So Robert's rules is you state a motion, and you either are for the motion, against the motion, or abstain from the motion. And I used to think that was really weird until I saw how you can write minutes that are not understandable. So it's important to motion, for, against, abstaining. The basis for requiring changes in or disapproving research. So in the template for the minutes, it'll say what are the changes wanted by the IRB in one column, and the other column it says what's the basis for these changes. Why are you asking for them? So there's an explanation for everything. And what's nice is then you can cut and paste that into the approval letters, or we can get Cicero to do that. And the same thing with disapprovals, the reasons for disapprovals. Another question that comes up is, controverted issues in the resolution. So a controverted issue is really when the IRB has debate. So it's when one member of the IRB says, you don't have enough subjects in this protocol. And the other member of the IRB says, why not? This should be enough to do that study. That's a debate. And the trick in doing minutes is to capture when people are having that, when there's disagreement like that, to document that, and then to document what was the IRB's final decision. The IRB decided that this wasn't, there were enough subjects or something like that. A controverted issue is not when people go, what does the investigator mean by that? And there's sort of a debate, and there's that sort of discussion. It's really one person says X and another person says otherwise. But we can work with you to help you with that. You can have a controverted issue. You can have a resolution that results in a unanimous vote, which does not mean that there's a split vote. Any question on records and minutes? Any things there?
Questions on controversial issues? Kate, Lane, analysts.
Sometimes we need to.
I was just saying, I think one of the
changes the paradigm shifts is, where we have documented the entire discussion, even when everyone is in agreement, and sort of what we're looking at, what to leave out.
Yeah.
That's been one of the issues here, and how comfortable in leaving out various, names of,
Oh,
who
yeah,
was coming
yeah,
and going,
yeah.
and there was a discussion, even though everyone agreed. Might not have been controverted, but there was still a discussion.
I'm a minimalist on minutes, and I believe you put in what you need by the regulations. I think it's not a good idea to put names in there. I mean, again, it's not a regulatory issue, but I think it's much better that the IRB debated whether or not children should be allowed in the protocol. Not that these two people thought that children should be enrolled and these two people should not. I think it's, I have to admit, and the problem is you'll never know when this is going to come up, is that OHP will come back and say, did you discuss this or something? And if OHP came back and said you needed to document this in the minutes, I would say, can you show me where it says that I needed to document that the IRBs had a discussion about something in particular, and do that. I think the one thing that I think you didn't have in a minute, so to recommend is have a list of items that the IRB reviewed. So if OHP wants to know, did the IRB review the consent document? Yeah, it's on the list of things that we said that we reviewed. But other than that, I don't like putting in summaries. I especially don't like putting in things that imply that nobody read the protocol except the person who was presenting, for example, because I think because then it's like, this protocol has 63. It plans to enroll 63 subjects to test them for this disease, and I'm thinking, well, if everybody read the protocol, why do they need that in the minutes? So. Those are things. So, but it'll anyways. And I think you can make minutes that are very easy. Have what's required by the regulations. If you really need to, you can include other things in there. But part of the issue is that it's easy to write minutes that don't have everything you need. It takes some effort to do that. So don't make your life more complicated by trying to capture things that you don't have to capture. And if you really stick to what you need to do, you can get the minutes done at the meeting, and like by the end of the meeting, all you got to do is spell check and check grammar, and you're done.
So what about I'm just thinking of the controverted issue in the resolution.
Yeah.
And, what about how they came to that agreement? So what if, Jess says children are appropriate, I say they aren't, we have a 30-minute discussion, the resolution is children are appropriate.
The IRB debated, the controverted issues, the IRB debated whether children should be included in the research. Resolution, the IRB decided that it was acceptable to include children in the research.
So we don't have to include an IRB member said there was a study 5 years ago and blah, 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 and, the rationale behind that.
That's where I would start.
Okay.
Until OHP put something in writing that said, no, you got to have more information. But I would say that's a controverted issue.
Okay.
It doesn't say what it's a controverted issue, it's the resolution.
So one thing that we've actually talked about recently, and I've looked back at sets of minutes and auditing our So if we are looking at, let's say, children, for instance, so the approvability of children as research subjects in any given study, and if Dean Musker comes to me and says, what did the IRB determine? I go back to the minutes, and they happen to be a set of minutes that say, the IRB determined that the inclusion of children is appropriate, the risks to subjects were determined to be X, Y, and Z, appropriately minimized by 1, 2, and 3. Permission of one parent is appropriate, assent of the child is written in 13 to 17, and verbal from 10 to 12, and we go through all those criteria documented in the minutes, the pediatric categories under FDA and DHHS. So that's what we've done in the past, and it's pretty extensive, and it's completely different.
Oh, for children, you have a different situation.
Right.
Because you've got a lot, because then you have subpart D that has a lot of find and document that, or at least find that, which OHRP interprets to mean the same as bind and document that.
So you would be in favor of including all that information specifically for children, how the IRB comes to determine?
You have to do it.
Yeah, that's a chart.
That
You
would,
have to do it. And if I can show you the minutes template real quick. It's under templates, which is
Yeah.
That's a chart.
The last section.
it's the first document in the templates.
First document in the last section.
The first page is just to document the names of the people at the meeting and their statuses and other things that are required by guidance. And then just basic information about the meeting. There's just a sort of a blank page for other business, which there's no regulatory requirements, but you can do that. And then if you go to review a protocol, there's a demographic information for the protocol, along with the documents reviewed. Place the document what consultants have given you. There's a table for controverted issues in the resolution, or you delete the table and say none. There's a determination of level of risk. This is not a regulatory determination. It is procedural. It's required by the VA, but more importantly, it's a useful tool to use to move more things to ex parte review. Because if the IRB says at this point it's minimal risk, as far as I'm concerned, it goes ex parte review from then on, unless there's some other problem with it. Regulatory determinations and protocol-specific findings supporting those determinations. This is where we get to the part about what's needed for children, pregnant women, waivers, and so on. And there's actually pre-built tables that you can fill in. Justification of any deletion or substantive modification of information concerning risks or alternative procedures contained in the HHS-approved sample consent document. This is that issue where if you're going to modify these sections of the sample consent document, you have to have a rationale in the minutes. Rationale for a significant, non-significant device determination. If required, you put that in. And a number of these things actually get deleted if you don't need them at all. What the motion is, if there were modifications required to secure approval, what they were, what the required change was, what the reason for the change is. If there's a deferral or disapproval, the reason for the disapproval and recommendations, and the reasons for any suspension or termination, and then the vote for, against, abstain, absent, or recuse, and substitutions. And if you go to this number of pages, there's tables there for determinations and protocol-specific findings that require documentation. So for waiver or alteration of the consent document, the determination is there, and then you need to fill in the box about why the IRB made that determination. And this box would then be put into the minutes, or could be put into the record. So I guess we got to figure out how we're going to do that. But this is certainly something that Cicero could just cut and paste it in. And if you're doing a paper system, the minutes are designed that you can cut and paste the minutes information directly into template letters.
okay, so, and we've been documenting each of the criterion for approval.
You don't need to do that. I would stop doing that.
And how they came to the determination that risks to subjects will be in relation to the anticipated benefits.
Yeah. I would stop doing that.
Okay.
I mean, there is this thing where people say, if you don't write it down, it wasn't done. Kind of thing. Here's how it was done. Because one is there's no regulatory requirement. Second thing, what you want is that when people go to the IRB members and say, how do you decide to use how do you decide to approve research? They say, I use the criteria in HRP 311. And they go to the next IRB member, how do you use this? I use the criteria at HRP 311. What happens at the meeting? We make sure the criteria at 311 are met. And so on. And that's it, and that's the party line. They're going to have a very hard time saying that the IRB did not make the regulatory determination. So. And it's in your SOPs. The SOPs say you're supposed to do it, the practices you do it, and that's that. and with all deference to, who was that guy? Who said if it wasn't documented, it wasn't done.
Nurses say that.
Huh?
Nursing says that all the time.
Nursing said that. It was right after Duke shut down, and it was the guy who was the director of OHRP before Koski. I can't remember what his name is. But I remember talking to him. Yeah, and he used to say, just like medicine. And I said, not true. So I'm in favor of just doing what you need to do. And the answer is I'm pretty sure that reading letters that OHRP is going to come back and say, you didn't document this in the minutes. And I think the question is can you show me in the regulations where that's required? Because we're trying to do that. But I actually think if they look at these minutes, you see these minutes are really hard to look at and not say these people are following the regulations. It's because it's right there. I mean, it's like you review a lot of minutes. It's very hard. I mean, you look at this and it's like controverted issues in the resolution, none. You don't have to go to them and say, did you have any controverted issues in the resolution? No, it says none there.
It's like I've talked to some of the analysts already and Cynthia already before. I've actually had the opportunity of conducting a site visit where this toolkit has been implemented and this minutes format has been used. And what I would say is, and we need to make sure that so this is a drastic reduction in the number of words and the number of days it's going to take for you to record those words. What I would say is be cognizant and be ever present in your mind about documentation of the controverted issues. For instance, if the IRB reviews a continuing review and there's new information there and there's a long, lengthy discussion about the investigator or safety of participants or and the IRB makes a determination that they're going to suspend the study or terminate the study, I would say be diligent in getting enough information in there so that going back, I don't want to look at a set of minutes and see that the IRB suspended this researcher because of issues they found with the continuing review. I mean, personally, I want to know what were the risk, was there a risk to participants? What was the issue? Was it serious? Was it non-compliance? What happened? I mean, there's not enough information there that this continuing review was reviewed and there was a discussion about information presented in the continuing review and the IRB suspended the researcher, suspended the study. So I guess the key word is balance. I mean, we're going from recording, having voluminous minutes and tomes pretty much of each meeting down to very abbreviated, very brief. Just be aware. So, thinking about what is it you want to have adequate documentation of the controverted issues and the resolution, not just there was one, it was resolved. So that's where I differ from Jeff a little bit, but I think we're better off toning it down gradually and making sure that we're capturing what we need to capture in terms of controverted issues.
Yeah,
Okay,
I mean, yeah. I don't have a problem with putting more in the minutes as long as the more does not interfere with the what the minutes have to have.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, I mean, for one is I will challenge you on what you put in if I think it's not necessary. If there's an abstract of the protocol, I say, why do you need that? You can go read the protocol. I mean, I know times it makes sense to me if a protocol has a really weird, long, complicated history, went to this committee and then actually went to this institution and then it was brought back to this institution. And that helps give an explanation of what occurs in a big, long stack of documents. I mean, that makes sense to put in there to help. It's not required by the regs, but it helps somebody who's looking through to see what was going on. But I think it's mostly, I'll challenge, you can push back. And if there's a good reason, then you got to do it. I mean, but if it's just we're doing it because this is the way we've already done, then I'm gonna push back.
I have a couple questions.
Sure.
Just regarding template here. Consultant report, is that just, what is that specific for?
If a consultant, if you use a consultant
Mm-hmm.
and you've asked the consultant, a question about is this standard of practice in ophthalmology, and they can say the consultant confirmed that this is standard of practice.
So just their information, basically, their
Yeah,
feedback.
yeah.
Okay. And then I have the controversial issues here, that's fine, but, so the difference between the justification or any deletion or substantive modification for the consent form versus the modifications required to secure approval. So obviously that's specific to the consent then, or is it based on the risks and procedures itself for the consent form?
That's based on the sample consent, which is not the same as the consent that
Okay.
the investigator gives you.
Got it.
So I think this is a long time ago. The sample consent form that NIH produced talked about an alternative that was not realistically available to our subjects or something. So we removed it and included the reason why we removed that risk or that alternative. And I think there was another time when the investigator said, I know they put this risk in here, but everybody knows that this risk is not caused by this drug. It's just, so I think it's appropriate. So we took it out. But then that meant that in the minutes we had the document in that area saying we took out this risk because it is our judgment that this risk has been shown not to be associated with this drug. It just happens to be in the package insert.
Okay. And so no summary. We're good with that.
Yeah.
I like
I
that.
know.
I really like that.
Well,
That makes
I would
sense to
throw.
me,
Okay,
so-
good. I mean, if you want to talk about it, then my next question is, what value does it add
Right.
to putting it in the document?
That's, to me, I mean, I see that, so.
It's easy to pick up the protocol and read what the
Right,
protocol is.
exactly. And then with the criteria for review, being, when do we implement that, Susan?
Tomorrow.
I actually have minutes here.
Well, my reason for asking,
This
I'm
is real.
planning on using this
Right.
template at tomorrow's
No,
meeting.
The ones you
so
gave me.
I'm just,
Okay.
I'm trying to,
You may do that. Sue used it at her meeting in July 22nd, and I've had Kate
8/19.
use it for some, and
Christina.
Christina
Actually,
did.
Kate and Lynn have been handling that for me.
Yeah.
I
So-
appreciate it very much.
and I, obviously I know the committee hasn't been trained with any of this new
Right.
information, so I don't want to be,
You can use the template
Okay.
tomorrow.
I use it, but I do have a comment about it. I struggle because it was my first time using it, and I just, went with what I thought, needed to be included. And when I came to studies that were fully approved, I was just like uncomfortable with not putting anything, like nothing, like. So I don't know if you already reviewed my minutes or not, but
No,
I gave for approvals.
This is the first set? Or these?
First set.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So like for approvals, because I was like, I don't feel comfortable like not putting anything at all, but just putting like the vote that it was approved, because there was no controversial issues, obviously, So I'll put like summaries, short summaries, just about the study, and then I'll put the votes for approved. But I didn't know because I was just like, I don't know what to do with this because. It's just the shifting of the paradigm, just going from what we've done before. I don't know if you've seen our minutes previously to, this new template. And so asking you the question, if a study is fully approved, there's no controversial issues, you just leave it blank, you don't put anything there.
Yeah. I mean, it's just, see, you have the type of review, documents reviewed, consultant report none, controverted issues, resolution none, level of risk, let's say greater than minimal. Regulatory determinations none. You could basically delete E and F and G. Motion approved. 10 for, 0 against, 0 abstained, 0 absent, 0 recused, no substitutions.
Okay.
And that's all you need.
I probably just put more
And then,
information in my.
And you said I don't know what to do. And my answer is go home 5 minutes early.
So what I want to ask you, why do you think we're changing the format of the minutes? Anybody?
Because it takes too long.
It's redundant. A lot of it's
Yeah.
redundant. The reviewer does the criteria for approval. I always thought, sorry, it was the stupidest thing. Why did the reviewers put it in their review and then you guys go and put it in your, I always thought it was stupid.
Well, we're not here making judgments.
I'm sorry,
So
I
using words like
apologize.
stupid is not acceptable in my mind.
I used to say that. So do Orchard people.
But
I thought they took a really long time to write up the minutes report, from meetings.
Mhm.
So I was thinking maybe one reason that we were changing it just to streamline it a little bit more so that it wouldn't take as much time.
Mhm.
Because, like some of the minutes reports could be like 60, 70 pages long. And it's just like you're writing like for days, literally. So that's the first thing that comes to my mind.
well, that's it.
Efficiency.
Yeah, and I think it allows us to focus on what is required and what is the controverted issues. And, I found that we do a lot of copying and pasting because the reviewers will read directly from their checklists. And sometimes when we do that, that can get away of what the purpose of the minutes.
Yes.
So Jeff, from the point of view of when we have a question raised from an outside agency of what were you guys thinking here? And so our first response is, geez, I hope our minutes are in good shape. So what you're saying here is actually we won't say that quite that way. We will say, here's our protocol, we followed it, and that's the end of it. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, and I'm not going to say, because I can't say, the Orchard people won't take some exception to it, but I think they're going to have a very hard time finding a regulatory justification to say that you didn't follow the regulatory requirements for doing minutes. And I'm thinking, those are the things. And if somebody comes up and says, did you consider, this information, it would be a matter of whether that information was given to the IRB members. And if there's a question of, did you consider this particular regulatory criterion, it would be yes, because it's in our SOP that people do this. It's in the checklist here, and that's what people discuss when they go over it. So it'd be justified with the SOPs.
So then every set of minutes somewhere would say we follow this protocol? Or
No,
is that
no,
simply
it's
in our policies?
It's in the
we
policy.
follow this
So
protocol?
conduct of an IRB meeting and goes over that and the expectations to IRB members.
So just to kind of take a pause and again make sure we all understand why we're here and what we're doing. And we have to look at history. So I can go back 10 years, which I have done, and looked at minutes and looked at protocol reviews and looked at the functioning of the IRB. And I can still find all kinds of problems with processes, non-compliance on every level, because 10 years ago was a long time ago in the world of where we are with accreditation. And certainly last week I was just for entertainment, I was looking through things from the 1990s. We would all probably fall off our chairs if you'd see, the kinds of minutes and the kind of documentation that this is how, it wasn't just us, it was everywhere in the country. This is how it was done. Very little information, very little emphasis on, what are the regulatory requirements, where do we need to be in compliance, how can we get there, how can we document and keep track. And I had this conversation the other week with Dr. Gerald. The pendulum was way over to one end. And over time, our pendulum swung, pretty far over to the other end. But I want to remind all of you the benefits and how we've gotten to where we are and the benefits of doing what we've done. This is an organization because I want you to feel good about what you've done. And I don't want anybody to leave here thinking, well, we've been doing it wrong. We've not. There was our site visitor for the very first time we were site visited by AHARB. We had 5 areas of distinction identified. We were told we had one of the best programs that they had visited. We've been revisited and reaccredited. We've been visited twice and inspected twice by the FDA. So we're not wrong. we've come a long way in terms of coming from non-compliant, not having good standard operating procedures, not being where we probably needed to be many years ago, to all the way to where, and we're not the only organization that's done this, I'm sure, where we've overcompensated a little bit, in some areas a lot. But we've done a good job. The work that you do is very high quality work. Our IRB members do exemplary reviews. I look at other programs. Jeff looks at other programs. We're not out there, we're not doing this because we're so messed up that we need to be fixed. This is taking us now from just, now we're zeroing in. Now we're getting very specific, very detailed. We're zeroing in. The target's this big around. We're going for the bullseye. We're getting rid of anything excess that we need to get, that we have, that we don't need to have. But yet we're not going to compromise on quality. By getting rid of the excess, I'm hoping that we improve our efficiency so that you're not, Christina, sitting for 4 and 5 days doing minutes. And then you do have more time to put towards your reviews. So that's why we're doing this. But I don't want anybody to feel like, well, we've been doing it all wrong, and I'm not picking on you, Deb, but it's been stupid the way we've done things. No, we've gotten here, and we're not in a horrible place. It's a pretty damn good place when we look at when I go out and I see other operations. So now we're taking it to the next level where, just like it's described in Jeff's toolkit, using the maximum flexibility we can, and applying the regulations, ensuring that we're compliant and we have good quality reviews and we have a good solid quality program, but we're as efficient as we can be, and we're a well-oiled machine, a streamlined, well-oiled machine. All right, I'll stop preaching there.
No, I when you were saying that, I have to say, and I hope it doesn't sound self-serving, but when people have asked me, what are the really good programs in the country, this is a program I tell them about. And especially I think what the IRB members have done in terms of, and I know we've been talking about last about the sort of struggle with the checklist and getting used to it and getting better and really realizing what the value of that is. And this is a place I tell people, if you want to, talk to people here, if you want to find out, what the struggles are and how to be good. So yeah, I would second that. This is really to sort of take it to the next level of doing what you need to do, but also cutting out what you don't need to do so that you can be efficient. And you get more work done and you can go home earlier.
Right.
Yeah, right. That's right.
We'll just work half days. No.
When I speak and people start saying, well, what I think we should do this, and I go, well, you can do that if you want. And then I usually ask people, please raise your hand if you're underworked and overpaid. And no hands go up. And I go, well, I don't know why people are doing stuff they don't have to do, but that's. Let's see, and then for sort of take us to the finish line here, what I want to talk about now are some of the regulatory criteria things. And the first sheet to turn to is go back to HRP 311, which is the criteria for approval sheet. This sheet would be 2 pages if it weren't for the VA, Department of Defense, Department of Navy, Department of Justice, Environmental Protection Agency, and Department of Education and the Education Department. But fortunately for 99% of what you do, it's all on front and back. Again, what is the regulatory basis of this? We go back to the criteria for approval. In order to approve research under this policy, the IRB shall determine that all of the following requirements are satisfied. And there'll be another talk that I'll give that will go over this specifically and sort of in great detail about this. It's the convened IRB that needs to make the determinations, and it's for all reviews. And these criteria are listed in Section 2 of this document. the other thing I want to point out is if you go to page 12, item 4, informed consent will be sought from each prospective subject or the subject's legally authorized representative in accordance with and to the extent required by 46116. And when I'm kind of reading it all together, in order to approve research covered by this policy, the IRB shall determine that all of the following requirements are satisfied, including that informed consent will be sought from each prospective subject or subject's representative in accordance with and to the extent required by 46116. And if you go to 46116, there's other things in here. Consent's got to be legally effective, that it minimizes possibility of coercion, undue influence, and so on. And the key link that I want to make to that is that in order to determine that 4 is true, you have to determine that everything in 116 is true. Okay. Similarly, number 5, informed consent will be appropriately documented in accordance with and to the extent required by 117. In order to determine that that's true, you have to determine that everything in 117 is true as well. So the main issue is that the regulatory criteria are a little bit more complicated than the A1 through 7 and B issues. And so the rest of this, some of this on here is information that it deals with the consent process. So if you go to section 5 of this and you read 46116, you'll see that what's in 46116 in the first paragraph corresponds to what's in section 5. And that what's in 46117 corresponds to what's in section 6, which is a long form of documentation. And that what's in the elements of consent disclosure are in 46116A and B, which is this additional checklist here. So basically, got everything fit on one page. Anybody who thinks they can memorize this, you're welcome. But this is what's important to do. There are things. We don't need to go over it directly, but what I want to remind you is that 4 and 5 about informed consent in 46116. And documentation 46117. If you go to FDA regulations, it cites different sections. So they're not identical, although the wording in the sections are pretty similar, but not quite. There are certain things that FDA requires, like you have to date consent documents that HHS does not require. Meanwhile, VA wants consent documents signed and dated, and signed and dated by the investigators. I don't think they want to witness. Oh, they took that out because they got in big trouble for it somewhere. I think they took out the witness. No, or did I say that? I got to look at the VA stuff. We'll get to it anyways. So some of the things that are on here are sort of written to the least common denominator or most restrictive procedures. So a few things on here go a little bit beyond HHS and FDA when it makes sense, rather than telling investigators that for HHS it's dated, but for FDA it's signed and dated, and for VA it's signed and dated, and you have to sign and date. So we just say you just do that for everything, and just make it simple, and not develop a lot of complexity that will lead to non-compliance. But anyways, basic concept, regulatory criteria, what IRB members really need to know, and what you need to know to actually review research is 111, 116, 117, or the corresponding sections of FDA regulations, which is 111, 50.25, 50.27, and 50.20. But so that's the key issue. Any questions there?
Have you done a cross-reference of all these things? So if I were to, I won't.
Okay.
If I were going to be on the worksheet of 311, criteria 2, that refers to 116 or that type of thing?
No, I mean, I could do that, but I mean, do you want me to do it?
No. I was just thinking from the point of view of it would be nice to be able to go, I'm speaking of someone who won't do this.
Right.
But it'd be nice to be able to go back and forth and say, oh, that reg is here. Now, maybe you all know all those by heart. Just an observation.
Okay, no, it's in.
Wonderful for the compliance group.
I was just thinking about that earlier, because I think if we were to present these findings to someone, well, what does it say in the regulation? Show me exactly.
Right.
And they've done that.
And it would be good for IRB members as they're doing this, they can, it will keep in mind.
Yeah.
Straight from the regs.
Yeah. We got to figure out how to fit it in.
I was thinking you wouldn't put it in there.
Oh, we just
I would have
make a
thought you would
reference,
have
make
a
another
separate
reference document. Yeah, oh, that'd be interesting.
It's,
In your SOPs, you typically
Yeah,
reference
the SOPs have
you know,
the have the
it doesn't
regulatory
list
reference.
it at that particular item, but the SOPs list the relevant
Right.
ICH and regs.
Yep.
And there's an SOP for each.
well, that's one. Yeah.
Correct.
You know.
Correct. Yeah, no, that's more work to do. No, I can do it. It'd be a good exercise. For me.
I think you need a law student or somebody
A
to
law
do that
student,
for a couple of
yeah.
years.
You know. Okay, so a couple of things just is that if you go down to section 2, I've kind of translated the regulatory requirement for consent, and that the informed consent process means one of these sections or checklists, which is you either follow the consent process, which is section 5, you do a waiver or alteration of the consent process, or it is permanently closed to enrollment, so you don't need to review a consent process. Similarly, for the long form of consent, the informed consent documentation, next box down, either meets section 6, the long form, or there's a separate checklist for the short form, or a checklist for waiver of documentation, or it's permanently closed to enrollment. So there are some options there. And then there are additional criteria corresponding to children, neonates, pregnant women, cognitively impaired adults, and prisoners. So everything kind of, there's actually additional checklists that may need to be associated with this. They're all driven directly from this checklist. And those things are in, so for example, there is a waiver of documentation checklist. Actually, let's go to waiver alteration. Let's see. Which is in the checklist. So I think hopefully if I forgot to mention, I'll mention again, and that is that if it's a checklist, it's usually a checklist because it needs to be filled out and documented. And now there are alternative ways. You could basically take what's in here and stick it in the minutes. You could take what's in here and rewrite it into the records. There's a bunch of things you could do, but essentially checklists mean that this is something that needs to be filled out and kept. A worksheet is something that needs to be used, but does not need. You fill it out if it's like filling it out, and you don't have to as long as you use it. For waiver or alteration of the consent process, this corresponds to 116C and D. Here I've got the reference. Here I've got the the first set of criteria in section 1 is 116D.
This is 424.
Should be 416, right?
Oh, this is 415.
415?
I'm sorry.
Oh, you said documentation.
I apologize. Yeah, no, I wanted to go over consent first. And this really combines the criteria for waiver of informed consent under 116D. The interesting thing about these regulations that makes life miserable is that although there's 4 criteria in the HHS regulations, in subpart B, it says that if the research involves non-viable neonates, you cannot use this option. And FDA regulations also have no ability to waive consent under these criteria. So again, this is a combination of multiple criteria from FDA regulations, subpart B and subpart A for that. For the part that corresponds to the find in documents settings, The idea is to say provide protocol-specific findings justifying this determination, which is really, why did you make that decision? The one I want to point out that people stumble over is the one research could not practically be conducted or carried out. Research could not practically be carried out without the waiver alteration. This is, what does that mean? And there is no guidance on what practically refers to, but a good sense is really from reading the NBAC Commission report, which basically talks about practicability as being, it doesn't mean that's impossible, but it means that what you would have to do in order to get it done does not make sense from a societal perspective. Now that doesn't mean that it doesn't make sense from the investigator's perspective, that just means it doesn't make sense from a societal perspective. In other words, it might be possible to get consent from 3/4 of the households in the United States, because that's what the Census Bureau does. But if there's something that you're trying to do that's important, it may not make sense to spend $7 billion to survey everybody in that sense of resources. Now, an investigator who says, well, I can't do this because I don't have enough time this week, or I don't have enough money to buy postage or something like that, here at that point, from a societal point of view, you can say that does not make sense. The other issue is that, how do you write this? The best way to write this, I find, is to sort of use what they call in logic reductio ad absurdum, which means that you start out and say, if consent had to be obtained, the following things would happen. And this would lead to that, and this would lead to that, and this would lead to that. And as a result, we would not be able to, the research could not get done. And one of the things I think is important, this is really, you're probably asking the investigator to write this up now. So I recommend really that the IRB write this up, not the investigator. The reason is you can ask the investigator reasons, but the issue I find is that the investigators don't understand sort of how to make this argument. We're going to have to work with you guys on it, but investigators will commonly say, I can't get consent because the research is retrospective. Well, first of all, it's not about why you can't get consent. It's about why, if you had to get consent, the research could not be carried out. And this takes a bit of thinking about this. And I'll give you an example where a place that continually said, this research is retrospective, therefore consent can't be done. And it was an interesting study where the investigator was interested in the physiology of deep-sea divers. These are guys who put on their special equipment, they dive 700 feet down to the bottom of some oil well or something like that. And he followed 4 of these people. And he wanted to look at, he had a lot of records on him. He wanted to review and analyze their records for something. I can't remember what. And on the continuing review, he writes back and he said, or the progress, something he wrote into the IRB later, he says, I got really good information on this. In fact, I emailed the 4 people who were taking part in the study, and I let them know what interesting stuff I had. So it was retrospective, but it was very clear that this guy was in email contact with these people all the time. It was really, it was clearly, if this person had to get consent, he would just email them, send them a copy of the consent, gotten the permission, and that would have been it. Similar things, I see things where people want to get some retrospective tissue specimens, and they want to get 10 specimens or something like that, and so but they want to do it in a way that's not exempt, or is not in a way that is human subject research and is not exempt, and so the question is if you're looking for ovarian cancer, there's probably 10 women admitted to this hospital with ovarian cancer. You could probably go around to the rooms, they could ask them consent and do that. I'm not saying that you want to do it, but the issue is you have to sort of look through and say, really, why is it that if you had to get consent, you couldn't do this research? Similarly, people will say things, well, if I had to get consent, not everybody would take part. And I go, we could use that for every study, right? Right. Anyway, so when somebody comes to you and you really need to be able to look at it and say, yeah, this is the kind of study where it's retrospective. If you had to get consent, it's clear that there would be a high percentage of people, or some moderate percentage of people, that couldn't be contacted, which would lead to bias in the data, which would result in this research not being able to be carried out. I mean, that would be more of an argument like that. This is a little bit tricky, but it's really something to think about, and something, if I look at these things, that's what I'm going to push you on, is sort of taking it to the syllogism of, if I had to get consent, blah, this and this and this and this and this, and that would be the end. And I'll probably push you to think creatively about, what if I told you you had to get consent? How do you think you could do the research? Because you might be able to come up ways that you could do the research, in which case, you know, it doesn't meet this criterion. So, any questions on that?
Yes, I have.
Yeah.
Can you just talk a little bit more about, so last week, I'm kind of recapping in my own mind. Last week, we were talking about taking the least burdensome regulatory path.
Yeah.
So, you know, if we can make it non-human subjects research, we want to do that.
Mhm.
If we can make it exempt, we want to do that. Can you talk a little bit about taking the least burdensome regulatory pathway and consideration for informed consent or waivers of written documentation, informed consent, or waiver of the informed consent process altogether?
I think this one is, number one, I would say with a lot of retrospective studies, my first thing I try and do when I see a retrospective review or collection of retrospective tissue samples is I say, one, can we make this not human research? And with a lot of these tissue sample studies, that's easy, because they just want archived specimens of pathology. They need no identifiers. Pathology can take the specimens, de-identify them, give it to them. It doesn't need IRB review. End of story. The other one would be to record the information without identifiers, which essentially means that as soon as you get the information, you get information that's existing anyway, and you record it, and immediately when you record it, that person is no longer a human subject. Does that make sense? When you're recording, when you record without identifiers, or record so that people can identify, there's really no period at which you have research data that involves human subjects. It's purely the collection of the data. So that's usually my first thing that I try and do, and then we don't have to worry about stuff. I do get sort of bothered when people go, you know, I want to do a retrospective chart review, but I really want to collect identifiers because I might want to go back and I might want to get more information, and then I start thinking, you know, you want to do non-exempt research and you're not really sure what data you're going to gather. So I tend to take a harder line on that. And I'm really looking for, you know, if people can justify making it exempt, then fine. You know, I don't have to worry as much about protecting subjects. But when people are just sort of getting arbitrary numbers and looking backwards and thinking, give me a good reason why it can't be exempt, is almost more what I'm doing rather than looking at the exemption at these. But if you do this, you have to. I mean, you can do it, and it should be done when it's appropriate. It's just a matter of documenting correctly and making sure that you've thought through how to do this in a way that's gonna make sense and stand up to regulatory scrutiny.
Wouldn't it be dependent on the data points though? Because certain things that are pretty like rare to be happening, like let's say data point is a lung transplant.
Yes.
And there are 20 in the year, and if the date is April 1st, you can identify that person as
Yes.
because there's only so many, you know, so wouldn't that bump it up to the next?
Oh, I'd agree.
Okay.
I agree.
That's
Yeah.
what I was just
Yeah.
wondering. Wouldn't it be
Yeah, I mean, you're
dependent-
saying somebody's going to collect tissue data on a lung transplantation?
Right, if so, yeah. Like
Yeah,
wouldn't
and when are they going to collect it? It's like-
prospectively.
Oh,
Or
prospectively?
Well, both.
Yeah. So when you know, the prospective collection thing, I mean, you want a lung transplant patient?
But it could be throwaway material.
I mean, one is they're sitting in the hospital for a while. Two is somebody's talking to them a long while. And three is that if you go and say, we'd like to take a piece of your discarded lungs so that we can save lives, they will never say no. Even if they're a Native American Havasupa. I think it's like, it's just, no, I mean, my experience with, I mean, that's why I look at that and go, there's no reason for that, you know, to get people, it's so easy to get people's permission. It almost doesn't make sense to waive consent in that situation. I mean, I don't see how you can actually. and you're not talking about that many people.
Right.
And so I used to take care of cystic fibrosis, and I used to tell people, I could go to the parents of CF patients, and I could say, can we give your left lung for research? And they'll say yes, and they wouldn't even ask me what it was for. It was. So people in that category usually are very interested in doing what they can to help.
I remember last week you were saying, about waiving, not consent, but documentation.
Oh yeah, waiving documentation.
And
Yes.
so in your view, is that the least burdensome regulatory approach for
Yes.
consent?
Waiving documentation is pretty easy. Let's get there. I want to talk about waiver consent a little bit more. I just want to point out a couple more things. Item 2 in the waiver alteration of consent is the probably one of the less commonly used forms, which is the research or demonstration project. That my experience is a small percentage, but that's what the issues are there. And then the waiver 3 is the waiver consent process for FDA-regulated research involving anonymous tissue specimens, and the guidance is listed there. This is based upon, I talked to you the other day about how device studies that study specimens are considered to be human subjects research. FDA has no waiver provisions for that kind of research, and it doesn't matter whether the people who gave the specimens are dead or anonymous or lost to follow-up. The FDA regulation strictly says you have to get their permission, which in the case of the deceased individuals would be a neat trick. So FDA, recognizing that, came up with a alternative, which unfortunately ends up being more complicated than like doing planned emergency research. But essentially, what you need to do is find all these things are true, and then what FDA is saying is that we're not going to hold you responsible for not getting consent. It is exactly the same as what OHRP said about the reporting issues, and it's really what would be called enforcement discretion. They realize they're not doing the right thing, but it's just sort of a problem with the regulations, and I'm not going to give you a hard time about it. But I wanted to point that out. And the fourth way is the waiver informed consent for planned emergency research, which we're not going to go into here.
Yeah.
Is there something else? Yeah. The next one is waiver of written documentation of consent. And this is bottom of page 15, where the IRB may waive the requirement for an investigator to obtain signed consent form for some or all subjects if it finds that the only record linking the subject in the research would be the consent document, and the principal risk would be the potential harm resulting from a breach of confidentiality. Each subject will be asked whether the subject wants documentation linking the subject with the research, and the subject's wishes will prevail. Or, and this is really the big one, that the research presents no more than minimal risk of harm to subjects and involves no procedures for which written consent is normally required outside of the research context. So this one has the waiver of written documentation of the consent process, HRP 416, has those two sets of criteria. The second one in the HHS regulations is the first box, and I've just reordered the boxes in terms of frequency of use. So this is the one used the most, which is the one that the research presents no more than minimal risk and involves no procedures for which written consent is normally required outside the research context. So this is almost everything that goes through expedited review. Everything in a social behavior university, I can put it that way, does not require informed consent normally. And most things in or I won't say most, many things in a biomedical arena do not require written consent outside the research study. So for example, if you are drawing blood on people, and that's all the procedures in the research are a single blood draw under the volumes, that if you go into one of those shopping mall doctor's kiosk or something, or you walk in your doctor's office, they're not going to have you sign anything in order to give permission to get a blood draw. You just walk in there and say, I need a blood, they do a blood. You walk down to the blood drawing people, they just do that. So there's no legal requirement outside of the research context for consent, and it is minimal risk, so you don't need a written informed consent for that. The unfortunate thing in the biomedical world is sometimes you need a HIPAA release or HIPAA authorization to do that. So it becomes a little moot, but you could certainly get away with not having a consent document for a circumstance like that, and for a lot of exempt research like that. Two other things that are on here, though, that are not in the regulations but make sense. One is people commonly confuse, investigators certainly confuse the written documentation of consent and the process of consent. That's a teaching issue. But one of the things to help emphasize that is to say, even if we are waiving the requirement for written documentation of consent, we want an information sheet or a script to know what you will give them for information and what you're going to talk about them with. Now, in some cases, so generally there should be a written script, and the written script has to contain the required and appropriate additional elements. That's what the investigator is promising to talk to someone about. And then on a case-by-case basis, you can just decide as appropriate whether that script should be given to somebody. So now if you're doing a phone consent, the RB can say, fine, just tell them the information in the script, get permission, that's it. Or you could say mail it to them. But I think if you're doing procedures where you're having face-to-face communication with somebody, unless there might be some extenuating circumstance, but generally then you would give them the information sheet. The information sheet essentially looks like a consent document without a signature block. That's really all it is. So usually for every study, and it actually is in the instructions, even if you're not obtaining written documentation of consent, there's still a requirement for a consent script so that you can check what's being told to people. Generally what I think is a good exercise is that if it doesn't matter whether the investigator decides they're going to get written documentation of consent. If you look at the study and you can say the study doesn't need written documentation of consent, then don't get it. Just say we approve this. You have to remove the signature blocks from there. Now, if you're doing the second form of waiver, in that form of waiver, you have to give the person an opportunity to sign if they want. So in that case, you're going to approve a signature block with a consent document, but you're going to say it doesn't, just hand them the consent document and don't sign it. Don't have anybody sign it. It's just an information sheet. But if they want to sign it, have them sign it and keep a copy. We try and talk them out of it. And let me see if there's anything else. And again, whether or not the person gets a written document, just a consent document without a signature block is really up to you. It's just a decision on what makes sense for that research. Any questions on that? I'm using that. But it's amazing the number of things that you can find. Did I talk last week about the investigator who said, I really have to pay more attention to consent now because I can't get a written signature? Yeah. It's a great story.
So there would be validation somewhere that the coordinator or the principal investigator actually gave that information to the subject?
The only reason you'd have to do that is in the rare circumstance that you would have a minimal risk clinical trial, in which case ICHGCP would say you want to document, you'd write a note saying I got consent from somebody. But otherwise, there would be no requirement for that. I mean, you could have a policy requirement for that, but I think again, we're talking minimal risk studies. We're talking studies that whatever you're doing would not require consent out. You're drawing blood from people. You're having them play some game and test their behavior or something. You're not, and it's all minimal risk. And these sorts of things you would probably partake in without thinking about it otherwise, without consent, except for the fact that it's in a research study. I don't have any problem if the investigator wants to say, got consent on this person, provided it's not the category 2. So if there's a risk to documenting consent in any way, I would not want the investigator writing down that, you know, I talked to this cocaine user, and he agreed to take part in the research. But otherwise, I don't really see a problem. But it is interesting that I don't know if you've heard that at institutions where I've implemented that, I had conversation with an investigator who was telling me, you know, at first when you told me not to document consent, I was really bothered by that. And I was really worried because I realized now that I really, really, really had to make sure that the subject knew what they were getting into, was really agreeing to the research, and wasn't just putting their signature on the document without understanding what's going on. Because I didn't have a piece of paper that I could go back to and say, see, they signed the consent document. So it does put the onus on people, I think, to really say that. I mean, if you think there's some legal reason why you might want to do it, you can do it. But I would say these are really should be low risk things and not require that. Definitely, if you do international research that's minimal risk, you really want to consider this, because this is signing pieces of paper is like a big thing in the United States, and it's just not a big thing in Africa and Asia. Many places, if you have people sign documents, you know, former Soviet Union, you know, you sign documents because you're turning in your family member or you're confessing to a crime. You don't sign documents to permit yourself to do things or to say that I fully understood things. And so sometimes, in some places, there's a very bad cultural context. The Philippines, another place, where when investigators are told to get consent for minimal risk research, people are happy to participate, but they're really put off by having to sign something and very, very afraid of wanting to do that.
Do we have consents for our foreign research?
Yeah, I mean, when we have greater minimal risk interventional studies, we can't waive until.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's no doubt.
But I'm not for this category.
We waive, I mean, if we can, do we not waive it, if we can waive it.
Yeah, the guy was doing, he was trying to find out fast food eating habits of Filipinos, and he couldn't get anybody to take part. You know, let's see. Let me just go over some other checklists here. There's research involving prisoners. This, by the way, there's a fifth category on here about epidemiologic studies that was added to the recently as a waiver of the regulations in the categories. And I don't think, I can just ask if people have any questions in general about subparts B, C. This is C, right? What is prisoners is C, yeah. And that, but it's really going through each of the things, and I think these are generally self-explanatory. I think I don't know, one of the things I see is getting adequate assurance from the parole boards that they will not take into account a prisoner's participation in the research. And do you have a particular way that you like to do that? I don't know. You ever get letters from the parole board saying they won't? No? Okay.
What do we have? 2? How many prisoner studies do we have? 2.
It seems like one, but it's only two.
Right, it's
Well, they come
And
through
a one that
disproportionate work.
Potential.
Yeah.
Two.
And I think subpart B is also, or the subpart C, the B, the pregnant women and fetuses are pretty self-explanatory as well. What one I want to go over in a little bit more detail because it's more complicated is the children's checklist, which is very long.
Pregnant women.
Yeah.
Consent below age 18. Any comments
About
giving consent when the pregnant woman is less than 18 years old?
Yeah. If the research involves pregnant children, I guess one question is if you're pregnant in Maryland, are you able to consent for yourself?
For research?
No, for procedures in general.
For procedures, it's even questionable.
Okay.
Certain medical.
It was venereal disease, drug treatment, nothing non-abuse, not medical care. So if I wanted to get treatment of my cold, I guess I couldn't give consent. Or prenatal treatment.
Some of it depends. So this comes down to who's a child under the HHS regulations. And what let's go to the regulations actually, because I want to go to page 25. So children are persons who have not attained the legal age for consent to treatments or procedures involved in the research under the applicable law of the jurisdiction in which the research will be conducted. And sort of going back a bit to why defining children is to look at 46401A, which this subpart applies to all research involving children as subjects, where children is defined as I just defined it. So let's say I'm taking individuals and I want to try and get an idea of how sleep deprivation compares to alcohol intoxication. There's actually a real study done at Brigham. And so I'm going to take volunteers and they're going to stay up all night, do a driving test. I'm going to take volunteers and they're going to drink an ounce of alcohol, take a driving test. And I'm going to sort of titrate it and be able to say, like, not sleeping overnight, staying up all night is the equivalent of driving with this much blood level of your alcohol, and do that. And they actually did this, and they found out that if you stay up all night and drive, it's equivalent to being impaired. I actually had in my residency program, and I'm sure it happens every year at a lot of places, that people will wrap their car around a tree after staying up all night. So so you're going to do that, and you're going to enroll 19 and 20-year-olds into this research. So the question is are those persons, have they attained the legal age to consent to the treatments or procedures involved in the research under the applicable law of Maryland?
No.
So they're children, right? Because children are the individuals who have not attained the legal age.
They're just not drinking age.
Hmm?
They're not children, they're just not drinking age.
No, it says here, children are persons who have not attained the legal age for consent to treatments or procedures involved in the research under the applicable law. And I asked the question, have these individuals attained the legal age for consent to the treatments or procedures involved in the research?
No.
So they meet this definition. Does that make sense?
Oh, you said 18 or 19, did you?
18, 19, 20. So it's a little bit far-fetched. And I immediately, when I saw this paper, it was in the New England Journal or JAMA, I can't remember which, and I immediately looked and saw that they only enrolled people who are 25 or older. But it's interesting in terms of what I'm trying to do is get you out of the concept of just saying 18 older, you're an adult, 17 younger, you're a child, because it isn't necessarily that simple. And this is sort of an interesting case, although it's a little bit contrived.
Does everybody?
No.
So why are these individuals not of legal? Why would they be considered children in this research?
Because in Maryland, the legal drinking age is 21.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Yeah, that wasn't clear. And with cigarettes, is that 18? Buying cigarettes is probably 21. I don't know, 12. Right. It doesn't really matter. Right.
Wait a minute. Legal age is defined by law, is it not? And I thought in Maryland it's 18. It's 18. It's not anything to do with alcohol.
No. But this is what I'm trying to point out. This is research specific. It's the procedures involved in the research. Because this will come up when we go in the other direction.
So the procedure was to drink a shot of alcohol.
Right. So they can't consent to those procedures.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying that everybody under 21 is a child. I'm saying that for that particular study, everyone under 21 is a child. That's really what I'm saying. Now, for the vast majority of studies you do, it's 18. If you're 18, you can consent to those procedures. If you're 17.99, you can't, and that's just the way it is. But when it comes up to things like if you're pregnant, most states have certain things that say if you're pregnant, you can do certain things. I don't know. You can get prenatal care. So if the research is the procedures involved in the research are prenatal care, and you're a 16-year-old pregnant woman, then you might have attained the legal age to consent to treatments or procedures involved in the research, and therefore for that research you would not be a child. And that was really the point I was trying to get at, that you have to look in part at exactly what's being done in the research and exactly what the state law is in terms of what certain individuals can consent to.
Well, we have exactly that situation because it is the treatment of an infectious disease that could be under the label of venereal in a 16 and 17-year-old pregnant women. And Maryland law says you can give consent under age 18 if it's for venereal type problems.
So
actually, it's in their babies. For this particular,
it's in their babies.
That's right.
Yeah, and and you have to look into that also because we're not talking about Yeah, because I know in New York State, for healthcare, if you're pregnant, you can consent to your child's treatment, but not, or if you're a mother under 18, you can consent to your child's treatment, but not your own, for example. So there's all sorts of cute things.
That same conflict is here.
Yeah. So if so let's just say let's say you're 16, but whatever the procedure is going on in the research, if they're outside the research context, you could consent to it. Then you are an adult. You're not a child. Actually, it's for that particular research study. And what's important is that one, subpart D does not apply. And most importantly is that you really can no more get parental permission, for that person as you can, any more than you can get parental permission for me, that my parents could consent for me to take part in the research. And I think, and the IRB would say, and now that does get into whether is that 16-year-old legally capable, not capable in the sense of understanding whatever it is that they're getting into. And you may decide, no, therefore the legally authorized representative has to consent. But these are sort of the issues, and what the real thing I'm trying to bust out is just saying, it's not 18, you got to really think about what's in the research. And that you will come across things where people under 18 don't meet this definition, or people over 18 do meet this definition. And if you were going to enroll 20-year-olds in that alcohol drinking study, you would have to, under this, they would have to meet subpart D. You would have to get parental permission. There are probably other reasons why you wouldn't do it, but just sort of strictly speaking, that way, that would be it.
So we would be breaking the regulations if we enrolled such a person in an alcohol trial. The subject would be breaking the law were he to enroll in the trial.
Yeah.
Great situation.
Yeah. Yeah, I wish I had a better example, but
That's
I don't.
a great example.
I wish I had one that was actually where if the other thing I don't know is whether parents can actually permit their child to drink alcohol under age 21. Some states they can, some states they can't. And it's anyways, just take it for the mind-opening experience. To put it that way, it's a tune in, drop out, and so I think people, you guys, I'm sure you know that in subpart D there's 4 categories. And I don't need to go over the 2 things there. Each of the categories have this statement that there has to be adequate provisions. I'm going to read it. That there has to be adequate provisions for obtaining the permission of parents and the assent of children. And so, what I want you to do is turn to box 7 on the research involving children checklist. And this is and so really one of these 5 things has to be true. Either you're getting permission from both parents or permission of one parent or waiving it under one of the 3 ways. And that's what you want, that's what you end up needing to document either in the minutes or you take this and it's somehow documented in Cicero or you scan it, a lot of things that you could do. And one of the things I want to remind you of is that the regulations actually say that permission of both parents is a requirement for all research, all categories. And actually, let's read it. Let's go back to it. So if we go to yeah, I'm trying to. Okay, it's 408B. In addition to the determinations required under other applicable sections of the subpart, the IRB shall determine in accordance to and to the extent required by 46116 of subpart A that adequate provisions are obtained for soliciting the permission of each child's parents or guardians. So that's the default, getting the permission of each child's parents or guardian. Where parental permission is to be obtained, the IRB may find, that the permission of one parent is sufficient for research to be conducted under the first 2 categories. Where research is obtained under the other categories and the permission to be obtained from parents, both parents must give their permission unless one parent is deceased, unknown, incompetent, not reasonably available, or only one parent has legal responsibility for the care and custody of the child. So the important thing is that with both parents, there's not, even when the IRB says both parents must give permission, it doesn't mean both parents. In all cases, you have the out that if dad's in Iraq, dad's not in the picture, mom has custody and dad's not around, that in those cases that the permission of one parent is okay. It really fulfills the requirement of permission of both parents in a way. So I'd like to say you need the permission of both parents when available, or unless one parent is out of the picture. The other one is then that the IRB may find that the permission of one parent is sufficient. And this one, the language is actually sort of analogous to the waiver, which says that IRB may approve a consent procedure which does not include or alters provided these requirements are met. So nobody would say, oh, if it meets those requirements, they just waive consent. It's really the IRB has to determine if that's the case. So the key issue here, and what this checklist is trying to do, is say the IRB's got to make an affirmative decision that either you get permission from both parents unless one parent's out of the picture, or you get permission from one parent even if both parents are in the picture. And that's the main thrust here. The other one then is adequate provisions for assent, which is box 11 on the last page, page 8. So the question is, are you going to obtain assent from all children, none of the children, or some of the children? If it's none or some, then you need to complete section 12 as to why assent is not necessary. And also if it's some children, which children don't need to have assent. One or more of the following are true. There's basically 4 reasons why the IRB can decide that assent is not necessary. Now the interesting thing, because I think you had talked about that certain age you would have written assent, and certain age would just give verbal assent or oral assent. Was that it? In a certain age. So one of the things I always have a twinge when I hear that, because I always go, isn't all assent oral? In other words, does that mean that is written assent mean I'm handing you a document but I'm not talking to you? And it's really the important thing, and I think this is the thing to stress with investigators, is that all assent by and large should be oral. I'm assuming unless the kid needs to be talked to in sign language. It's communication. It's not signing a piece of paper. And so I don't like the idea of saying written consent or written assent. It's really written documentation of consent or written documentation of assent. The interesting is, what are the regulatory requirements for assent? For written documentation of assent. Let's go read the regulations. So if you go to 46408E, which is on page 28, just above the 46409 words. So it says, when the IRB determines that assent is required, it shall also determine whether and how assent must be documented. So when does assent need to be documented? Right. And when does it not need to be documented? Right, when the IRB says so. So technically speaking, there is no requirement for getting documentation of assent. There's no requirement. It's up to the IRB to decide whether documentation is obtained. And I think I talked about this last time about, if you everybody's got to go home, read the Belmont report tonight, and you have to tell me what the Belmont report says about a consent documentation, let alone consent documentation. And then you have to tell me what ethical principle is for consent documentation. And the answer is consent documentation is not mentioned in the Belmont report. There really is no ethical principle that justifies it other than the fourth Belmont principle, which is CYA. And that it's really a, I often look at it and say it's the American way of signing papers. It's the legal method. And I offer you to think that if, I don't care if you're talking about a clinical trial, if you sat down and you talk to somebody about what's going on, you explain to them what's happening, they understand what's going on, they understand what they're getting into, they've gotten the information that they need, they're making a voluntary decision, they're not being coerced or influenced, they have been given understandable language, they have not been given any exculpatory language, and they say, yep, I agree, I'm going to take part in this research, and they go into the research, I would argue that there's nothing unethical about that if they don't sign a consent document. That makes sense? I mean, what's the difference in signing a consent document in that situation and not signing a consent? It's just having a piece of paper. I mean, you say, well, it'd be really good for them to know what you talked about. Fine, hand them the piece of paper that has it. Do you need a signature? I mean, the signature is just signature is very much legalistic American way type thing. And I actually think the same thing is true with assent. I mean, I as a pediatrician, sort of laugh about this, having little kids sign things. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense to me. And the other thing I think that's true with assent is that assent is very, very specific to the child's age and the procedures. And I just remember they knew every asthma medication they were on. They could tell you how the stuff worked. They were smarter than their parents when it came to taking care of their asthma.
And I've certainly had 14-year-olds who, certainly who are, mentally disabled. And, they are, have the function of a 4-year-old, and their parents need to take care of them all the time. And other 14-year-olds who are like too sick to understand what's going on and so on. So a lot of the things that come down with assent, I think, really come down to the individual situation of what's going on with the investigator and, with the child and what the research study is about. And I don't have a problem with assent documentation, but I think the focus needs to be on the process and what you're trying to do with assent. And understanding is that the regs basically make it an option. You want assent, get documentation, get assent documentation. You don't want assent documentation, don't get assent documentation. The key issue is get assent unless you meet the criteria for assent is not required. The other issue is, how does assent need to be documented? Regulations say the IRB shall determine how assent must be documented. So one of the things that I put in the procedures that is like the default for documenting assent is that on the consent document is a little note for the investigator. And it says, did you obtain assent? Yes, no. If no, why didn't you obtain assent? Child can't understand, whatever the particular reason. Or IRB said assent was not required. But they just document whether they got assent and what the reason is. And really that is as valid as I think all the effort that goes into writing these documents. And I actually do think that the documents almost detract because they make people focus on the piece of paper rather than sitting down with the child and saying, figuring out what is this child going to understand, what do they need to know, how much can I explain to them, make sure that they're comfortable doing whatever they want to do, and so on. So that's end of editorial, honestly. But when you do get a scent, where did my checklist go? The checklist has documentation for whether or not a scent is required. If a scent is required, whether or not the investigator has to document the assent and the signature on the consent document, or whether there's some other method is used for documentation. And I have to tell you that in most children's hospitals, there are no assent forms. Assent forms are interestingly a phenomena outside children's hospitals, everybody else. So it's certainly a valid way under the regulations and saves some work. And again, sort of focuses people. Says, it's your job. Yeah, I don't know if anybody's ever seen consent documents that at the end of them say that the subject has to sign off. I understand everything told to me in this consent document. All my questions have been answered. I understand that this is voluntary. And I always want to change those and say, you can have this on the consent document, but the investigator has to check them and attest to the fact that, in their opinion, all these are true. That the subject understands that the subject's questions have been answered, that the subject is making a voluntary decision. Because if the investigator doesn't think that's true, it doesn't matter what the subject writes down. In fact, I think the investigator is obliged not to enroll somebody in a study who's like that. So it's the process, not the document. So the only thing I hate more than adverse events is consent documents. Actually, I think I dislike adverse events more. But anyways. And then maybe assent documents. Let me see what time it's. Where are we getting to? Anyways, okay, 3:35. Let me go over cognitively impaired and just checklist. There are no regulatory requirements for cognitively impaired subjects. There was a subpart E on the books about cognitively impaired subjects for a while, but now that they came out with registration, which is the new subpart E, now they got to call it subpart F, I guess. But it has never really picked up to have for OHP to write something specifically for cognitively impaired subjects. OHP, on the other hand, has AHARP, on the other hand, is looking for organizations to have specific criteria. The VA has specific criteria, and ICH-GCP has specific criteria. So what this document is combines just if it's VA subjects, it gives you the VA criteria. If it's research where there is no anticipated direct benefit to the subject, it follows mostly the ICH-GCP criteria. And if it's research with its anticipated benefits to the direct subject, and it's, I'll admit, it's something I sort of made up and adopted from other things, and really this is really open to, if you want to get a study panel going, they wanted to decide what the criteria are going to be, that would be fun. But it's those two things. But the main thing is Section 3, which is the VA, you're pretty much stuck with until they change 1200.05. And I'm sure when they change it, it will only add more criteria. It's the VA way. And research involving cognitively impaired adults where there is no anticipated direct benefit to subject, most of that is a ICH-GCP requirement. And the where there is anticipated direct benefits is essentially following ICH with a couple of additions.
Can you go over Section 2?
Section 2, yeah.
Number 2.
So the first one is subjects have a disease or condition for which the procedures involved in the research are intended. So if you're not taking Alzheimer's patients and studying acne medication,
for example. I mean, you're studying something that has to do with cognitive impairment, with adaptation, with, something related to that. The objectives of the trial cannot be met by means of study of subjects who cannot give consent personally. So you might be looking for, particular things in the blood. If you can get those from people who have the ability to consent, you should do that. Foreseeable risks to the subject are low. Negative impact on the subject is minimized and low. This is really, if there's no direct benefit, then what you're balancing is the importance of the knowledge to the risk and discomforts, and in addition that they should be, there's some level of importance and knowledge that you still can't subject people to risk for if they can't consent for themselves. I think subjects will be monitored, withdrawn if unduly distressed, that there is a plan to assess capacity to assent. The subject will be informed about the research to the extent compatible with the understanding, which is really assent, if you will. Same thing really with children. Children should be, who are getting assent, should be informed to the extent that they have the ability to do that. The IRB can decide really arbitrarily whether they think that assent should be obtained of all subjects, some or none. Consent document has a signature line for an LAR, and if capable, the subject will sign and personally date the written consent. So, do you have anything in there?
Yeah, I'm not too fond of this, the way this is worded.
Okay.
Negative impact on the subject's well-being is minimized and low.
Yeah, it's right out of ICH-GCP.
I know. But
If you had a different way of wording it that means the same thing, then you can do that.
we can try and tweak that.
Yeah, yeah.
I see this. I see IRB reviewers are getting hung up on this.
Okay.
On the language.
Yeah, yeah.
Like define low.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the problem with taking all these things and putting them together. And it's interesting because ICH is really very light on IRB issues, and it just happens to be really prescriptive on this. I mean, it essentially says you have to worry about payment and consent, and actually doesn't talk about risk, benefits, alternatives, or anything like that. So yeah, so there's some things in here that are. This one is by and large here to. I think it's a good idea. It's a good idea to have some sort of criteria, but exactly what's in here can be modified.
Do we have an SOP for this as well?
No, for most things, the way the SOP is sort of like this. The person who prepares the meeting, and this is a paper system, we'll have to figure out how to make this work electronically, but in a paper system, the person who prepares the meeting puts together an agenda packet. If the research involves adults unable to consent, they put that with that stuff. The letter says, read all this stuff and fill out all the checklists, or use all the worksheets and checklists. Be prepared to discuss at the meeting. And then and then at the meeting, the conduct of the SOP says you go over the protocol, the 311, and all the applicable checklists, and this is referenced by that. So it's there, but there really is no. I mean, this is the SOP, if you will. I mean, it's more that, and that's the way people would use it. And I mean, you'll see SOPs written up with all these things the IRB's got to think about. My experience is that when they're written up that way, the IRB never uses them. So if it's like this, and you say fill it out, they're much more likely to use it than saying, unless you hand them the SOP and say use this each time. And there's a lot of the procedures are written that way. I mean, they're really sort of figuring out how to get them done without doing that. And I'm happy to say I think I have every single thing mentioned only once in the right place. So if you ever needed to make a change, you would only need to make a change
to some of these things to one place. The time it gets difficult is when you can make changes that have side effects elsewhere. You got to make things correspond.
Do you have a question?
Just wondering.
All right.
I have a question. Maybe I'm not reading this correctly. But number 2.
This is which checklist?
I'm sorry, this is the cognitively impaired.
Yes.
You know, it says the research involving where there's no anticipated direct benefit to the
Yes.
subject. And all items need to be yes. So the foreseeable risk to subjects are low. Or, but in the case where it's greater than minimal risk, and the subject's, you know, the risk to the subject it's pretty great. I mean, these risks are high. So in this case, obviously the risk to the participant isn't low. It's not a.
I'm sorry. So this is why would the risk be high?
Well, if it's death, I mean, obviously, or
Yeah.
depending if it's going to full board, for example. This is
Yes.
a protocol going to full board.
Mhm.
Normally, these risks are pretty great to the participant.
Mhm.
So my question is, with an LAR, in this case, how would we interpret this, I guess?
Well, I think if you have a research study with no anticipated benefit to subjects, I think even with cognitively intact people, you have to have something really important to justify risk of death in the research.
Right. A lot of times, though, that's what the portion that's missing on these studies.
Is
I guess when they come to us and they're submitted, the PI doesn't necessarily. They don't really fill out that section clearly.
right.
So that's, I guess, the way this checklist is, the way I'm looking at it, it's kind of difficult to rationalize this the way it's coming. When we see these protocols, the benefit
Yes.
is not clearly defined. A lot of times with the
Right.
LAR, there is no benefit sometimes when
Right.
it's greater than minimal risk.
Yeah.
And
those are the studies Susan Gillette would point out say we shouldn't be doing in cognitively impaired.
Right.
If there's not a benefit
Yeah.
to that
Well, you
population.
got some Maryland rules, right? Yeah.
And so when there is no anticipated benefit to the population, the cognitively impaired population, there has to be some kind of potential benefit, or they're the ones we need to look at and say, well, wait a minute, because that's one of the situations that we have with one of the audits, the study that was audited. That's a really good example using cognitively impaired adults, and what's the potential benefit to the cognitively impaired adults?
Well, it was described in the protocol as such, but
Yeah,
really,
but
in retrospect.
right, when you really look at it, there's probably no benefit whatsoever, no prospect benefit to the participants at all.
I mean, sometimes, but I'm just saying, sometimes when they're submitted, it comes in that way. We need clarification from the PI, and sometimes when you ask them, they will say, they don't necessarily understand even the policy, or well, at the time
Yeah.
when we say policy, you need to have a benefit here, and we need clarification on this. And when they come back, they'll say, okay, obviously and sometimes there clearly is benefit, and they don't really understand that either. What they put in there to begin with wasn't very clear, but sometimes there isn't,
So one issue is that when investigators are submitting something, they're not telling you what the risk and benefits are.
they'll fill something out, but it's very ambiguous. Sometimes it is, or
I think
it's
sometimes they're afraid to overstate
exactly.
the prospect of benefit.
Oh yeah.
It's more or less
No, I've
that.
seen that. I've seen IRBs too. I'm always surprised when I see phase 3 studies and they say that there's no prospect of direct benefit to anyone.
Right, exactly. So it's kind of, here or there kind of thing. And so instead of saying there's this potential for benefit, or coming right out and saying it and stating it, there's this, they don't do that. So.
Yeah. So this, in other words, that they might have, it might be like a drug study,
Sure, absolutely.
and the drug is designed to improve memory in Alzheimer's disease, and they don't want to say, you know, a potential benefit.
Exactly.
Is that, I mean, some of it may be wording and also educating the investigators, because just like the problem is that there's the word risk and the word benefit. We tend to use those together, but they don't make sense put in context, because a risk is a probability of something happening, and a benefit is something good happening.
Right.
And so when you commonly in language, and I think that this is pretty much through the instructions to the investigators, risks and potential benefits. And so, I mean, it's okay to say there's a small chance of this, or there's a big chance of this. I mean, just like they would say there's a good chance that, you know, your hair will fall out, you know, or there's a small chance that you will have a life-threatening allergic reaction. You know, it's just the probability and magnitude issues.
Right.
Yeah, so that may be a matter of, I mean, it's just working with the investigators to do that. It's also part of what, in a sense, scientific review is about, so that if somebody says, you know, there's no benefit here, and somebody says, no, there's been, you know, this drug has good evidence that it is likely that it will produce health for people. You know, I can't guarantee anything,
right,
but that would be it. Or if somebody says there's no risks, somebody looking at it goes, wait a minute, you're doing, you know, even if they're doing an MRI and saying, you know, it's loud noise, you get claustrophobic, you know, you have to make sure you're well screened to make sure you don't have problems with metal. You know, those are the risks. So, you know, having somebody look at it to be able to evaluate, again, the validity of the information may help as well. I mean, in the end, these decisions are the IRB members' decisions.
right.
But they do need good information to make those decisions given by the investigator. But once they have that information, then these are judgment calls that need to be made. Somebody else has.
I was just going to comment on what Karen was saying. I think with the greater than minimal risk studies and the cognitively impaired populations, I think in a lot of ways we aren't asking the right questions in our submission, so that the investigators don't realize that they really need to I don't want to use the word justify, but explain to us this potential for benefit, specifically with this population, because we don't ask that when they select cognitively impaired. You know, with children, we ask about the benefits specifically. We don't ask about it for cognitively impaired. So I don't think they're being prompted to necessarily elaborate on that criteria.
I mean, it should be something that's asked for every single research study.
We ask for benefit in general, but taking into consideration cognitively impaired, we don't specifically say please comment, because I think the way it's worded is specifically for cognitively impaired. There has to be that potential for greater benefit than greater risk, and we don't particularly word it that way. So I think that makes it difficult for the investigator to give us the information we need, because we aren't asking maybe the question appropriately.
Well, I think you want to be careful, because I think what you don't want the investigator in a position of making the IRB's decision. So let's take the case of subpart D, second category, that the risk is justified by the anticipated benefits to the subjects. What you need from the investigator are what the risks are and what the anticipated benefits are, and you should have that for every research study. And then it's the judgment call for these kids: is the risk justified by the anticipated benefits? And it's not really up to the investigator to do that justification. I mean, they can give you a justification, but it's not. But in the end, it doesn't matter what they say. It's a matter of what the. In other words, you shouldn't be saying the investigator's given a good justification. You have to make the justification. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I was just wondering if maybe we need to, on our end, elaborate on, because the cognitively impaired section, I think, we have this great worksheet checklist now, but as far as our application, I'm not sure that we're asking.
Yeah. I mean, it should be. I mean, when you ask, I know you don't like the wording of, risk or minimized and low or something like that. But again, what the investigator says, the risks are nervousness, claustrophobia, loud noise, is that, and that we'll be giving people earplugs and watching them, and if they don't like being in the magnet, we'll take them out. I mean, I think that's, you can say, our risk minimized and low. I think you can make a judgment on that. We may have a different judgment, but you can make that judgment without asking the investigator to say, please justify that the risks are minimized and low. So you want the information from the investigator, the facts. If need be, have a process to verify those facts, and then you're making the judgment calls. Is it minimized? Is it low? Is it adequate? Is it justified? Is it reasonable? Is it minimized? Those sorts of things are really that's what ethical decision making is about, as opposed to having the investigators give you the scientific facts. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I think it's just having seen this at a meeting a couple times. Maybe the members who need some education, they seem to get hung up on what they're supposed to be evaluating, and they want that information from the investigator. So maybe on our end, it's some education to our IRB members too about what that means.
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing I would push is I really don't like it when, I know people do this, and there's reasons to do it, but when people start asking investigators and say, justify that risk are reasonable in relationship to benefits, or justify that that the research could not practically be carried out without the waiver, or justify that this is minimal risk. It's like, in the end, that's, we get all those things are judgment calls for the IRB to make, and the problem is when somebody says, oh, that's a good reason, I'll take that reason, or the investigator didn't give a good enough reason, so you got to rewrite the application. I mean, it's your decision. It's not the investigator's decision. I mean, I think it'd be sort of, I don't know. I'll think of an analogy, but it really is the IRB's decision.
No, I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, and I know IRB members do that, and I've seen application forms that are basically justified that all the regulatory criteria are true, and it's I think you're asking the wrong questions of the person because you guys. Again, it's sort of like the decision about what is research. It takes training. It takes understanding how to apply this, how to think about it. You're not going to give that to investigators. But you can certainly expect them to write down what the risks, the benefits, the procedures, and then for you to make the judgment from that information.
The one thing that I will say, though, and this is for Anne and the education team, and that is the needed education in the research community about using cognitively impaired individuals in the research. It's not a group that should be considered for any old research project out there. It should be very specific, and it should be very thoughtful about they should be very thoughtful about using cognitively impaired adults in their research. And I think that's one. I've gotten calls before where I want to get, it's a minimum, one particular example was I got a call from an investigator. I have an elderly woman in the ICU. Her son is here. She's cognitively impaired, but I want to get this blood drawn. I want to get her in the study. It's a blood draw. It's minimal risk, blah, 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 blah. And I said, and why do you need her blood? Why do you need to enroll this particular woman? You're going to enroll 100 people or 50, whatever it was. Why do you need her? It wasn't reviewed. It wasn't considered to the IRB didn't consider using it cognitively impaired. Why do you need this one person, this woman who's cognitively impaired in the ICU? And the answer was he really didn't. It was convenient. He was there, and I said, well, then don't enroll her. Get somebody else. It's just they're not a convenient sample. They're not. It's not just because they're easy and their son says it's okay, then it's okay to go ahead and enroll them. There's more. There should be more consideration than that. And this investigator did the right thing and called up and asked the question, which was a good thing.
Have I warned him? No, I still haven't warned everybody up.
Oh, actually, I had a question. It's not related to cognitively impaired, but going back to assent, and if the IRB decides that oral assent is sufficient for a study, and you don't need, documentation of assent, do they still need to submit like a script that they will use for the children? Because a lot of times I've seen some assent form submitted and it's exactly the same as a consent form, and that's how they're going to talk to the children. So it was like we have to send them back like, oh, you need to lower this. They're not going to understand this wording. So I think it's something that we've been double checking to make sure the wording is appropriate for children. So I guess in terms of sort of oral assent, or should we ask for something, the script or just like information sheet for children or something, so that we see that, it's easier for them to understand.
It's not unreasonable. I'm not a big fan of it, and the main thing is because it's like you're just dealing with such a wide population of capabilities, and that assent by its very nature needs to be customized to the capabilities of the child. So I can't say it's wrong. I think my concentration, what I would rather do is I'd rather know that the investigator understands what assent is, understand their approach to assent, how they decide what information to communicate and not communicate that's in the consent document. And I'd kind of rather know that, with the understanding that there's no one-size-fits-all assent document. And I don't think I know people do it by age, but I don't think you can. You have to do it by sort of mental age and status and other things, which is not as good. And you can't use the word oral assent anymore. No more can we use the word oral assent or oral consent. It's assent.
Assent.
And consent.
Okay.
Documentation, writing or not in writing. That's all.
Okay.
And hopefully, same thing with agreement. I hope that everybody orally agrees or orally consents or orally assents. Whether it's also documented in writing would be a different issue. I was trying to think if it's not oral. I guess they could. The sign language, I guess, would not be oral.
You included ICH, HTG for a reason.
Yes.
Would we be having to meet those regulations, or under what circumstances?
This is another thing called simplicity and compliance and everything like that. You could do that. One thing you could do is go back and look at your contracts and see how many contracts require ICH GCP. And also look at your protocols and see how many protocols require ICH GCP. My experience is that it's about 50%. You might find a really low number. My experience is you have already, knowingly or unknowingly, you have already agreed to compliance with ICH GCP for 50% of your protocols. So part of it is what's the cost of becoming 100% ICH GCP for clinical trials, only for clinical trials, and or what would the cost be, both in terms of maintaining compliance and with the 50% that you have to be compliant with. So it's a recommendation, although it's not absolutely required. Would be just do ICH GCP for everything. For the IRB point of view, it's fairly easy. I mean, it really is.
So I unknowingly obviously have agreed.
Probably.
Probably,
and if it's not in the contract, it's commonly in the. I see it in protocols.
And we follow, and we've been inspected and accredited on the basis of following ICH GCP. And our auditors audit our investigators' study conduct according to ICH GCP.
Yeah. I mean, having the investigators follow is a little bit more difficult, but actually, I think it's. I look at it and think it's the right way to do research. And again, if they have the time, they're obligated to do it whether they know it or not. Yeah. So they may as well do it all the time.
I have a general question
Sure.
about participants or potential participants who are illiterate.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just thinking of a situation where the protocol says participants, in addition to all of these inclusion criteria, they must be able to provide informed consent. And then an IRB member, let's say before the meeting, says, are you including participants who cannot read? And they say, oh yes, we're going to include them, we're going to read the consent form to them and have a witness. And say, okay, approve with the modification that you modify the consent form and have a witness signature block. And then let's say that the industry sponsor says, no, we don't want to include participants who are not able to read. In this case, would you consider that the study would have to go back to the fully convened IRB because they determined that based on that criteria that participants who are illiterate are eligible to participate and therefore subject selection is equitable based on that premises? I just wanted to see what your thoughts were about that.
I don't know, I'll ask your thoughts on it. Let's see here. Oh, so let's pick out the checklist here. I probably reordered these. There we go. So go to HRP 413. Yeah, 413. It's the eligibility for review using the expedited procedure. Tell me when you're there.
I'm
Okay.
here.
Go to box 2 and answer the questions.
Out loud.
Sure.
The modifications do not affect the design of the research. I would say no. The modifications add no more than 160 subjects. No. All procedures fall into categories 1 through 7 below.
All added procedures.
All added procedures fall into categories 1 through 7 below. So based on that, I would say it would be a minor modification.
So I would say it doesn't need to go to the convened IRB.
Okay.
And if you don't like that, you can change the definition of minor modifications. But this is really how it works. It's really you might have said no, it's a major change in design, but it's really asking the questions, take you through it, and I didn't have to give you my opinion. How's that? That was the best part.
Even better.
Yeah. But my opinion is it should go to the convened IRB. My opinion is you should follow the SOPs. And if you don't like the answers the SOPs are giving you, change the SOPs. Great lesson. Great. Did I pay you to do that? No. Anything else? I think. Anyways, well, you guys deserve T-shirts for hanging around all day. That's all I'm going to say. For 2 days and listening to me. I hope I haven't spoken too rapidly. That's fine. My wife keeps saying, "Slow down." Whenever I do primer, that's usually there's usually several people in the audience who say he speaks too fast. So I'm working on it.
Jeff, I really got a lot out of this. I appreciate the
Thank you.
time and
Thank you for your
trouble
time.
you've gone to. I simply hope that we never have a reviewer that knows the regs like you do.
We haven't.
Well, I know, we did. Again. Yes, again. So thank you very much.
If not, get me back and I'll argue with them.
Well, I think we're going to want you back for other reasons.
Well, I just need the directors and Cynthia and Monique